YouTube FAM. Welcome back to our podcast, where we dive into the most fascinating topics and make you laugh at the same time. I'm your host, Mira, and I'm super to be here with my co-host, Leo.
Thanks, Mira. We've got a blast today. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a coffee addict. We've got a fantastic topic lined up for you, and I know you're all going to love it.
So, let's get started with the usual. What's the most ridiculous thing that's happened to us since our last podcast? I'm pretty sure Leo here tried to cook breakfast while simultaneously doing a stand-up routine. Am I right, Leo?
No comment, but I will say that I managed to burn the toast. Again, Mira here just laughed and said, well, at least you're consistent.
Oh, burn. Okay, moving on. We're here today to talk about two amazing countries, Comoros and Saudi Arabia. No, I know what which one should I visit? Which one should I live in? Don't worry, we've got you covered.
That's right. We're going to dive deep into the differences between these two countries, so you can make an informed decision. Whether you're a travel enthusiast, a foodie, or just someone looking for a new adventure, we've got the scoop.
And of course, we're powered by the amazing folks at JetOff AI, who help us bring you the best content possible. Thanks. Guys, you're the best.
Yeah, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. We've got a ton of great content lined up for you, and we don't want you to miss it.
Okay, so let's get to the good stuff. Today's topic is all about Comoros and Saudi Arabia. We'll be covering everything from safety and economy to education, nightlife, language learning, and family-friendly vibes.
That's right. We'll be answering all your burning questions. From which country is more expensive, to which country has a richer cuisine, and, of course, we'll be sharing some of our own personal experiences and anecdotes along the way.
So if you're visiting or moving to either of these countries, or if you're just curious about what they have to offer, then this podcast is for you. We're your comprehensive guide to helping you make informed decisions.
And as always, we're here to entertain you as well. So, sit back, relax, and get ready for a fun-filled ride through Comoros and Saudi Arabia.
Thanks, Leo. And don't forget to join us next time on our podcast, where we'll be exploring another fascinating topic.
Yeah. And don't forget to follow us on social media, where we'll be sharing some behind-the-scenes peeks and sneak previews of our upcoming content.
Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for tuning in. Everyone, until next time, stay happy and keep on laughing. Hey, let's dive into general safety and crime rates in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever been to Comoros? I've heard it's a hidden gem with stunning beaches and coral reefs.
Actually, Mira, I've been to Comoros once, and it was an incredible experience. But what's fascinating is that Comoros has a relatively low crime rate compared to other countries in the region. They have a strong emphasis on community policing and social cohesion, which helps to prevent crime.
That's so true. Leo, I've read that Comoros has a very low crime rate, with most crimes being petty theft or vandalism. But have you noticed that crime rates in Comoros are often linked to poverty and unemployment?
Exactly. Mira, poverty and unemployment can be major drivers of crime, and Comoros is no exception. However, the government has implemented various initiatives to address these issues, such as providing training and job opportunities for young people.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Comoros would agree with me that the government's efforts are commendable. But let's move on to Saudi Arabia, which has a more complex situation when it comes to crime and safety. Have you noticed, Leo, that Saudi Arabia has a very strict penal code?
Ah, yes. Mira, Saudi Arabia's penal code is indeed very strict, with harsh punishments for even minor crimes. But what's interesting is that the country has been working to modernize its justice system and reduce crime rates. For example, they've introduced new laws to protect women's rights and reduce domestic violence.
That's a great point. Leo, Arabia has made significant strides in addressing women's rights and reducing domestic violence. But I'm curious, what about the role of social media in Comoros and Saudi Arabia? Do you think social media has an impact on crime rates in these countries?
Ah, yes. Mira, social media can have a significant impact on crime rates in both Comoros and Saudi Arabia. In Comoros, social media has helped to raise awareness about crime and safety issues. While in Saudi Arabia, social media has been used to promote radical ideologies that can contribute to crime and terrorism.
Wow, that's a great point. Leah, social media can be both a blessing and a curse when it comes to crime and safety. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think social media has a positive or a negative impact on crime rates in these countries?
Well, Mira, I think our listeners will have to wait on that one. But what's interesting is that both Comoros and Saudi Arabia have made efforts to regulate social media and prevent the spread of radical ideologies.
That's right. Leo, both countries have implemented measures to regulate social media and prevent the spread of radical ideologies. But let's not forget that crime rates in Saudi Arabia are often linked to corruption and abuse of power.
Ah, yes. Mira, corruption and abuse of power can be major drivers of crime in Saudi Arabia. But what's encouraging is that the government has made efforts to address these issues and increase transparency and accountability.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Saudi Arabia would agree with me that the government's efforts are a step in the right direction. But let's move on to some more practical tips for staying safe in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. Have you got any advice? Leah?
Yes. Mira, for Comoros, I would recommend being aware of your surroundings and avoiding traveling alone at night. And for Saudi Arabia, I would recommend being mindful of local customs and dress codes, and avoiding discussing politics or religion with strangers.
Great advice. Leo? And let's not forget that our listeners can always check the official government websites or consult with local authorities for more information on safety and crime rates in these countries.
That's right, Mira. And finally, I'd like to say that both Comoros and Saudi Arabia have a lot to offer in terms of culture and tourism. If you're planning a trip to either country, be sure to check out the local markets, try some delicious food, and soak up the atmosphere.
Well, that's all for now. Folks, thanks for joining us on this episode of our podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on social media for more exciting content. And if you have any questions or comments, please let us know in the comments section below. So, let's dive into the fascinating world of Comoros and Saudi Arabia. Both countries have unique approaches to governance and social harmony, and I'm to share my insights with you.
Ah, yes, Comoros, with it that we can coconut, with its blend of French and Arabic influences. And Saudi Arabia, with its rich history of tribal governance. It's a fascinating contrast, don't you think?
Absolutely. Comoros has a relatively stable government, with the president serving as head of state and the prime minister as head of government. But what's really interesting is how the country's history of colonialism has shaped its politics.
That's a great point. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, has a more complex system, with the king serving as head of state and the prime minister as head of government. But what's really striking is how the country's Wahhabi ideology has influenced its social norms.
I'm curious. Leo, have you noticed how Comoros has a strong tradition of community-based conflict resolution? It's almost like a mini council of elders that helps resolve disputes.
Ah, yes. That's a great example of Comoros' emphasis on social harmony. And speaking of social harmony, Saudi Arabia has a fascinating approach to mediating disputes through Islamic law.
I'm not sure if I agree. Leo, from what I've read, Arabia's system of justice can be quite harsh, especially for women and minority groups.
But that's a great point. The system of justice in Saudi Arabia is indeed complex and can be quite punitive. But what's interesting is how the country's social norms are influenced by its conservative values.
I see what you're saying. Leo, But don't you think that Comoros' more relaxed approach to governance could be seen as a model for other countries?
Oh, I'm not sure about that. While Comoros has a more relaxed approach to governance, it's also true that the country faces significant challenges, such as poverty and unemployment.
That's a great point, Leo. But I think what's really interesting is how both countries are working to address these challenges through innovative approaches to social harmony.
Ah, yes. Comoros has a unique approach to addressing poverty through its Comoros Solidarity Program, which provides support to vulnerable communities.
And Saudi Arabia has its own initiatives, such as the Saudi Vision 2030 program, which aims to diversify the economy and promote social welfare. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think are the most significant challenges facing Comoros and Saudi Arabia in terms of social harmony?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges facing both countries is addressing the growing wealth gap and promoting social mobility.
I see what you're saying, Leo. But don't you think that Comoros' strong tradition of community-based conflict resolution could be a model for addressing this challenge?
I think that's a great point. Mira, Comoros' approach to conflict resolution is indeed a valuable example of how community-based approaches can promote social harmony.
And speaking of social harmony, I'm curious, Leo, have you noticed how both countries are working to promote cultural exchange and understanding through initiatives like cultural festivals and exchange programs?
Yes. That's a great example of how both countries are working to promote social harmony through cultural exchange.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that cultural exchange programs like these are effective in promoting social harmony?
Well, I think it's a great start. But it's also important to address the underlying issues of social inequality and economic development.
I see what you're saying, Leo. But don't you think that promoting cultural exchange and understanding can be a powerful way to build bridges between different communities?
Yes. I think that's a great point. Lira, cultural exchange and understanding can indeed be a powerful way to promote social harmony.
And finally, I'd like to say that for more insights like this, don't forget to check out Jet Off AI, where you can find expert analysis and commentary on global issues like social harmony and governance.
Thanks, Mira, and thanks to our listeners for tuning into this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more in-depth analysis and commentary on global issues.
I'm to dive into the economic conditions and cost of living in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. Let's start with Comoros, shall we? I've heard it's a great place for a beach vacation. But what about the economy?
Yes, Comoros. The economy is mostly driven by agriculture, fishing, and a growing tourism sector. It's not a bad place to live, but the cost of living is relatively high due to the limited economy and reliance on imports.
That makes sense. I've read that Comoros has a high poverty rate, which can affect the cost of living. But what about Saudi Arabia? I've heard it's a major player in the Middle East economy.
That's right. Saudi Arabia has a highly developed economy, driven by its massive oil reserves. However, the cost of living is also very high, especially in cities like Riyadh and Jeddah. The country is working to diversify its economy, but for now, it's still heavily reliant on oil exports.
I can see why the cost of living would be high in Saudi Arabia. But what about the job market in Comoros? Is it easy to find work there?
Actually, finding a job in Comoros can be challenging, especially for expats. The economy is small, and the job market is limited. However, the government is working to create more opportunities for locals and expats alike.
I'm curious. What kind of jobs are available in Comoros? Are there any industries that are growing?
Well, the tourism industry is growing, and there are opportunities in hospitality, tourism management, and related fields. However, the salaries are relatively low, and the cost of living is high, so it's not the most attractive option for expats.
That's a good point. I've heard that Saudi Arabia is a great place for entrepreneurs and business owners. Is that true?
Yes, Saudi Arabia has a thriving business environment, and the government is actively encouraging entrepreneurship and innovation. However, the cost of setting up a business in Saudi Arabia can be high, and there are strict regulations to follow.
I'm sure our listeners living in Comoros would agree that the cost of living is a major concern. How do you think the government can address this issue?
Well, the government can work to create more jobs, improve infrastructure, and increase access to education and healthcare. This would help to reduce poverty and make the cost of living more manageable.
That's a great point. And what about Saudi Arabia? How does the government plan to address the high cost of living?
The government is working to diversify the economy, create more jobs, and improve infrastructure. They're also investing in education and healthcare, which will help to reduce poverty and make the cost of living more manageable.
I'm curious. What's the average salary in Saudi Arabia? Is it high enough to support a comfortable lifestyle?
The average salary in Saudi Arabia is relatively high, but it depends on the industry and the job. However, the cost of living is also very high, so it's not always possible to live comfortably on an average salary.
I see what you mean. It's a trade-off between the high salary and the high cost of living. But what about Comoros? Is it possible to live comfortably on an average salary there?
Actually, it's not easy to live comfortably on an average salary in Comoros. The cost of living is high, and the salaries are relatively low, so it's a challenge for expats to make ends meet.
I'm sure our listeners would appreciate some advice on how to navigate the cost of living in Comoros in Saudi Arabia. Do you have any tips?
Well, in Comoros, it's essential to budget carefully and plan for the high cost of living. In Saudi Arabia, it's essential to research the cost of living and plan accordingly. It's also important to be flexible and adapt to the local culture and customs.
Thank you, Leo, for your insights on the economic conditions and cost of living in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. I'm sure our listeners will find this information helpful.
You're welcome. Mira, it's been a pleasure discussing this topic with you. I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the information and advice we've shared.
So, I'm curious about Comoros, a country that's often overlooked in the accommodation conversation. What are your thoughts on the housing market? Leo?
Comoros is indeed a fascinating case study. Their housing market is relatively limited, with a focus on traditional beachside huts and villas. But, I must say, the unique architecture and stunning ocean views make it a dream come true for beach lovers.
I completely agree. And have you heard about the affordable prices in Comoros? I'm talking about villas that would cost a fortune in other parts of the world. It's like a tropical paradise on a budget.
Yes, affordability is a major draw for Comoros. However, it's essential to note that the housing market is still developing, and infrastructure can be lacking in some areas. But, for those willing to take the plunge, the rewards are well worth it.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Comoros would agree with me that the island's laid-back atmosphere and stunning natural beauty make it an ideal place to relax and unwind.
That's true. And speaking of relaxation, have you heard about the luxury resorts in Comoros? They offer top-notch amenities and services, making it an excellent choice for those seeking a high-end experience.
Yes. The luxury resorts in Comoros are indeed a treat. But what about the more affordable options? I'm sure many of our listeners are curious about the local markets and traditional housing.
Absolutely. The local markets in Comoros offer a wide range of affordable options, from traditional beachside huts to self-catering apartments. And, with the island's growing tourism industry, there's an increasing demand for more modern and stylish accommodations.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think the affordable prices in Comoros make it an attractive option for digital nomads and remote workers?
That's a great question. Mira, I think the affordability and laid-back atmosphere in Comoros make it an excellent choice for digital nomads and remote workers. Plus, the island's growing expat community provides a great support network for those looking to make the move.
That's a great point. Leo, and speaking of expats, have you heard about the housing challenges faced by foreigners in Comoros? I'm sure many of our listeners are curious about the process of finding and renting accommodation in the country.
Yes. The housing market in Comoros can be quite complex for foreigners, with limited options and a lack of transparency in some cases. But with the right guidance and research, it's definitely possible to find a great place to call home.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Comoros would agree with me that the country's unique culture and stunning natural beauty make it a truly special place to live.
That's true, Mira. And as we move on to our next country, Saudi Arabia, I'm to compare their accommodation options and quality with Comoros.
Yes. Saudi Arabia is indeed a fascinating country with a unique housing market. What are your thoughts on their luxury apartments and high-end villas? Leah?
Saudi Arabia's housing market is indeed impressive, with top-notch luxury apartments and villas that rival those found in major cities around the world. But I must say, the prices are certainly not for the faint of heart.
I completely agree. The prices in Saudi Arabia are indeed steep, but the quality and luxury of the accommodations are well worth it. And have you heard about the modern amenities and services offered in Saudi's luxury apartments?
Yes. The luxury apartments in Saudi Arabia offer top-notch amenities and services, making it an excellent choice for those seeking a high-end experience. From infinity pools to private cinemas, the options are endless.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think the luxury apartments in Saudi Arabia make it an attractive option for high-end travelers and expats?
That's a great question. Hira, I think the luxury apartments in Saudi Arabia make it an excellent choice for high-end travelers and expats, with their top-notch amenities and services. Plus, the country's growing expat community provides a great support network for those looking to make the move.
That's a great point. Leah, and speaking of expats, have you heard about the housing challenges faced by foreigners in Saudi Arabia? I'm sure many of our listeners are curious about the process of finding and renting accommodation in the country.
Yes. The housing market in Saudi Arabia can be quite complex for foreigners, with limited options and a lack of transparency in some cases. But with the right guidance and research, it's definitely possible to find a great place to call home.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Saudi Arabia would agree with me that the country's unique culture and stunning natural beauty make it a truly special place to live.
That's true. Mira? And as we wrap up our discussion on accommodation options and quality in Comoros and Saudi Arabia, I'm to hear from our listeners and learn more about their experiences in these countries.
Yes. We'd love to hear from you, our listeners. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And let's keep the conversation going. To head to the world of visa requirements, immigration procedures, and official paperwork for Comoros and Saudi Arabia. I'm sure our listeners living in Comoros would agree with me that navigating the bureaucracy can be quite an adventure.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this topic. Do you guys have any horror stories about trying to obtain a visa or deal with the local authorities?
Let's start with Comoros. From what I've gathered, the visa process is relatively straightforward. You can obtain a visa on arrival, and it's valid for up to 45 days. It's essential to check the latest requirements and regulations before traveling.
That's great to hear. Mira, I've heard that Saudi Arabia has a more complex visa process. You need to apply for a visa through the Saudi Arabian embassy or consulate in your home country, and it can take several weeks to process.
Yes, I've come across that information too. But what's interesting is that Saudi Arabia has introduced a new e-visa system, which can expedite the process. It's still not as straightforward as Comoros, but it's a step in the right direction.
I've heard that the e-visa system is still in its infancy, and there are some technical issues that need to be ironed out. But I'm sure it will improve over time. In the meantime, what can our listeners do to make the process easier?
Well, I would recommend checking the official government websites for both countries, as well as consulting with the embassy or consulate in your home country. It's also a good idea to work with a reputable travel agency or tour operator who is experienced with the visa process.
That's great advice. Mira, I'm sure our listeners will appreciate it. And what about the cost of the visa? Are there any significant differences between the two countries?
Yes. The cost of the visa can vary significantly between the two countries. Comoros has a relatively low visa fee, whereas Saudi Arabia's visa fees can be quite steep. especially for longer stays.
I see. Well, it's always good to be prepared for the costs involved. And what about the length of stay? Are there any restrictions on how long you can stay in each country?
Yes, there are restrictions on the length of stay in both countries. Comoros has a maximum stay of 45 days, whereas Saudi Arabia has a maximum stay of 90 days. It's essential to check the latest requirements and regulations before traveling.
I've heard that Saudi Arabia has some strict rules about the length of stay, especially for visitors who are not from the Gulf Cooperation Council countries.
Yes, that's correct. Arabia has strict rules about the length of stay, and visitors need to ensure they comply with the regulations to avoid any issues.
I'm sure our listeners will appreciate this information. And what about the process of renewing a visa or extending a stay? Are there any specific requirements or procedures that need to be followed?
Yes. The process of renewing a visa or extending a stay can be quite complex in both countries. It's essential to check the latest requirements and regulations before attempting to renew or extend your visa.
I see. Well, it's always good to be prepared for the bureaucratic process. And what about the role of the embassy or consulate in the visa process? Can they provide any assistance or guidance to visitors?
Yes, the embassy or consulate can provide valuable assistance and guidance to visitors. It's always a good idea to contact them before traveling to ensure you have the latest information and requirements.
I've heard that the embassy or consulate can also provide assistance with other issues, such as lost passports or travel documents.
Yes, that's correct. The embassy or consulate can provide assistance with a range of issues, including lost passports or travel documents.
I'm sure our listeners will appreciate this information. And what about the process of applying for residency or citizenship in Comoros and Saudi Arabia? Are there any specific requirements or procedures that need to be followed?
Yes. The process of applying for residency or citizenship can be quite complex in both countries. It's essential to check the latest requirements and regulations before attempting to apply.
I see. Well, it's always good to be prepared for the bureaucratic process. And what about the cost of residency or citizenship? Are there any significant differences between the two countries?
Yes. The cost of residency or citizenship can vary significantly between the two countries. Comoros has a relatively low cost of residency or citizenship, whereas Saudi Arabia's costs can be quite steep.
I see. Well, it's always good to be prepared for the costs involved. And what about the benefits of residency or citizenship in each country? Are there any significant differences?
Yes. The benefits of residency or citizenship can vary significantly between the two countries. Comoros offers a range of benefits, including access to education and healthcare, whereas Saudi Arabia offers a range of benefits, including tax-free income and access to government services.
I've heard that Saudi Arabia has some strict rules about the requirements for residency or citizenship, especially for visitors who are not from the Gulf Cooperation Council countries.
Yes, that's correct. Saudi Arabia has strict rules about the requirements for residency or citizenship, and visitors need to ensure they comply with the regulations to avoid any issues.
I'm sure our listeners will appreciate this information. And what about the process of applying for a work visa in Comoros and Saudi Arabia? Are there any specific requirements or procedures that need to be followed?
Yes. The process of applying for a work visa can be quite complex in both countries. It's essential to check the latest requirements and regulations before attempting to apply.
I see. Well, it's always good to be prepared for the bureaucratic process. And what about the cost of a work visa? Are there any significant differences between the two countries?
Yes. The cost of a work visa can vary significantly between the two countries. Comoros has a relatively low cost of a work visa, whereas Saudi Arabia's costs can be quite steep.
I see. Well, it's always good to be prepared for the costs involved. And what about the benefits of a work visa in each country? Are there any significant differences?
Yes. The benefits of a work visa can vary significantly between the two countries. Comoros offers a range of benefits, including access to education and healthcare, whereas Saudi Arabia offers a range of benefits, including tax-free income and access to government services.
I've heard that Saudi Arabia has some strict rules about the requirements for a work visa, especially for visitors who are not from the Gulf Cooperation Council countries.
Yes, that's correct. Arabia has strict rules about the requirements for a work visa, and visitors need to ensure they comply with the regulations to avoid any issues.
I'm
sure our listeners living in Comoros would agree with me when I say that healthcare is a top priority. Let's dive into the access to and quality of health services in this beautiful island nation.
Yes. Comoros is a great example of a country that's still developing its healthcare system. From what I've researched, the government has been working to improve access to healthcare, especially in rural areas.
That's correct, Leo. In fact, the government has implemented a number of initiatives to increase access to healthcare, including the construction of new hospitals and the training of healthcare professionals.
And I'm sure our listeners would be interested to know that Comoros has made significant strides in reducing child mortality rates, which is a major indicator of a country's healthcare system.
Exactly. According to the World Health Organization, Comoros has seen a significant decline in child mortality rates over the past few years. This is a testament to the government's efforts to improve healthcare access and quality.
I'm curious. Mira, it's kind of like a thing. Have you come across any information on the cost of healthcare in Comoros? I'm sure our listeners would be interested to know if it's affordable for expats.
Yes. The cost of healthcare is an important factor to consider. From what I've gathered, healthcare costs in Comoros are relatively low compared to other countries in the region.
That's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners would appreciate knowing that they can access quality healthcare at an affordable price. But what about the quality of healthcare in Comoros? Is it on par with other countries in the region?
Well, Leo, the quality of healthcare in Comoros is improving, but it still has a long way to go. The country faces challenges such as a shortage of healthcare professionals, unlimited access to medical equipment and supplies.
I see. That's a shame. But I'm sure our listeners would be interested to know that Saudi Arabia, our second country of comparison, has made significant investments in its healthcare system.
Yes. Arabia is a great example of a country that's prioritizing healthcare. From what I've researched, the government has invested heavily in modernizing its healthcare system, including the construction of new hospitals and the recruitment of top-notch healthcare professionals.
And I'm sure our listeners would be impressed to know that Saudi Arabia has implemented a number of innovative healthcare technologies, such as telemedicine and electronic health records.
Exactly. Saudi Arabia is definitely a leader in healthcare innovation. But what about access to healthcare in Saudi Arabia? Is it easy for expats to access quality healthcare?
Yes. Access to healthcare in Saudi Arabia is generally good, but it can be challenging for expats who are not familiar with the system. But don't worry. Our listeners can rest assured that there are many resources available to help them navigate the healthcare system.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would appreciate knowing that they can access quality healthcare in Saudi Arabia. And finally, let's talk about cultural nuances. How do patients interact with healthcare professionals in Comoros and Saudi Arabia?
That's an interesting question. Mira, from what I've researched, patients in Comoros tend to be more reserved when interacting with healthcare professionals, whereas patients in Saudi Arabia tend to be more open and communicative.
I see. That's a great point. Leo, cultural nuances can play a significant role in the way patients interact with healthcare professionals.
And I'm sure our listeners would be interested to know that there are many resources available to help them navigate the cultural nuances of healthcare in both Comoros and Saudi Arabia.
Yes. And finally, let's talk about the role of traditional medicine in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. How do traditional medicine practices influence modern healthcare in these countries?
That's an interesting topic. Mira, from what I've researched, traditional medicine plays a significant role in Comoros, where many people rely on traditional healers for their healthcare needs.
And in Saudi Arabia, traditional medicine is also an important part of the healthcare system, with many hospitals and clinics offering traditional medicine services.
I see. That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested to know that there are many resources available to help them understand the role of traditional medicine in modern healthcare in both Comoros and Saudi Arabia.
Yes. And finally, let's talk about the importance of preventive care in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. How can expats prioritize their health and well-being in these countries?
That's a great question. Mira, from what I've researched, preventive care is a key aspect of healthcare in both Comoros and Saudi Arabia, with many hospitals and clinics offering preventive care services such as vaccinations and health screenings.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate knowing that there are many resources available to help them prioritize their health and well-being in both Comoros and Saudi Arabia.
Yes. And finally, let's talk about the role of technology in healthcare in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. How is technology being used to improve access to healthcare in these countries?
That's an interesting topic. Leo, from what I've researched, technology is playing a significant role in improving access to healthcare in both Comoros and Saudi Arabia, with many hospitals and clinics using electronic health records and telemedicine services.
I see. That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested to know that there are many resources available to help them understand the role of technology in healthcare in both Comoros and Saudi Arabia.
Welcome back to our podcast. We're exploring the unique transportation infrastructures of Comoros and Saudi Arabia. I'm Lyra, and I'm to dive into this topic with my co-host, Leo. Let's start with Comoros. What do you know about its transportation landscape?
Comoros. I was to learn that it's actually one of the most remote archipelagos in the world. Getting around this island nation can be a challenge, especially when it comes to public transportation. I bet our listeners in Comoros relate to this traffic chaos.
Yes, I can imagine. Comoros has a limited public transportation system, with buses and minivans being the primary modes of transportation. With a population of around 850 people, it's not surprising that the demand for public transportation is high. What about Saudi Arabia? Leah, how does its transportation infrastructure compare to Comoros?
Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, has a more developed transportation network. With its massive investment in infrastructure, the country has built an extensive network of highways, airports, and seaports. In fact, Saudi Arabia has one of the highest per capita car ownership rates in the world. I bet our listeners in Saudi Arabia would agree that having a car is a necessity.
That's fascinating. Saudi Arabia's transportation infrastructure is indeed impressive. It's worth noting that the country's reliance on private vehicles has led to significant congestion in major cities like Riyadh and Jeddah. I bet our listeners in Comoros would love to have a transportation system like Saudi Arabia's.
Well, maybe not the congestion part, but yes, a more developed transportation system would definitely make life easier for the people of Comoros. Speaking of transportation challenges, have you heard about the new airport terminal in Comoros? It's a game changer for the country's aviation industry.
Yes. I've heard great things about the new airport terminal. It's a significant investment for the country, and it will definitely make traveling to and from Comoros easier for tourists and locals alike. What about road quality in Comoros? Leah? I've heard that the roads can be quite rough in some areas.
Yes, road quality is a significant issue in Comoros. The country's roads are often unpaved and poorly maintained, which can make traveling by car a bumpy ride. However, the government is working to improve the road network, and there are plans to build new highways and improve existing ones.
That's good to hear. It's always exciting to see governments investing in infrastructure projects. And speaking of infrastructure, what about Saudi Arabia's ambitious transportation plans? I've heard that the country is planning to build a high-speed rail network and expand its metro systems.
Yes. Saudi Arabia's transportation plans are indeed ambitious. The country is investing heavily in its rail network, and there are plans to build a high-speed rail line between Riyadh and Jeddah. The metro systems in major cities like Riyadh and Jeddah are also being expanded to reduce congestion and improve public transportation.
Well, that sounds like a lot of exciting projects. I'm sure our listeners are eager to learn more about these developments. And speaking of transportation, what about the cost of transportation in Comoros? I've heard that it can be quite expensive, especially when it comes to taxis and private vehicles.
Yes, transportation costs can be a challenge in Comoros. However, the government is working to make transportation more affordable for locals and tourists alike. There are plans to introduce a public transportation system that will make traveling around the country more affordable and convenient.
That's great to hear. It's always exciting to see governments working to make transportation more affordable and convenient. And speaking of convenience, what about the availability of transportation services in Saudi Arabia? I've heard that there are many options available, from taxis to ride-hailing services.
Yes. Saudi Arabia has a wide range of transportation services available, from taxis to ride-hailing services like Uber and Karen. The country also has a well-developed public transportation system, with buses and metro lines connecting major cities and towns.
That's great to know. It's always helpful to have options when it comes to transportation. And speaking of options, what about the environmental impact of transportation in Comoros? I've heard that the country is taking steps to reduce its carbon footprint.
Yes. Comoros is indeed taking steps to reduce its carbon footprint. The country is investing in renewable energy sources, such as solar and wind power, to reduce its reliance on fossil fuels. There are also plans to improve public transportation and encourage the use of electric vehicles.
That's great to hear. It's always exciting to see countries working to reduce their carbon footprint. And speaking of reduction, what about the reduction of traffic congestion in Saudi Arabia? I've heard that the country is implementing traffic management systems to reduce congestion.
Yes. Saudi Arabia is indeed implementing traffic management systems to reduce congestion. The country is also investing in public transportation and encouraging the use of ride-hailing services to reduce the number of private vehicles on the road.
That's a great strategy. It's always helpful to have a plan to reduce traffic congestion. And speaking of plans, what about the future of transportation in Comoros? I've heard that the country is planning to invest in new transportation infrastructure, including a new seaport.
Yes. Comoros is indeed planning to invest in new transportation infrastructure, including a new seaport. The country is also working to improve its road network and expand its public transportation system.
That's great to hear. It's always exciting to see countries investing in new transportation infrastructure. And speaking of infrastructure, what about the role of technology in transportation in Saudi Arabia? I've heard that the country is using technology to improve public transportation and reduce traffic congestion.
Yes. Saudi Arabia is indeed using technology to improve public transportation and reduce traffic congestion. The country is investing in smart traffic management systems and using data analytics to optimize traffic flow.
That's great to know. It's always exciting to see technology being used to improve transportation. And speaking of improvement, what about the impact of transportation on the economy in Comoros? I've heard that transportation plays a significant role in the country's economy.
Yes. Transportation plays a significant role in Comoros' economy. The country's transportation sector is a major contributor to its GDP, and it also creates jobs and stimulates economic growth.
That's great to hear. It's always exciting to see transportation playing a significant role in a country's economy. And speaking of excitement, I'm sure our listeners are eager to learn more about the unique transportation experiences of Comoros and Saudi Arabia. What do you think, Leo?
I think we've covered a lot of ground today. Mira, it's been a pleasure exploring the transportation infrastructure and convenience of these two countries with.
I'm curious to know how language barriers affect communication in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. In Comoros, the official language is Comorian, but French is widely spoken, and Swahili is also used.
The complexity of language in Comoros. It's like trying to solve a puzzle. But I've heard that in Saudi Arabia, Arabic is the primary language, and English is becoming more widely spoken, especially among the younger population.
That's right. And I've noticed that in Saudi Arabia, even though Arabic is the main language, you can still communicate with English, especially in tourist areas and among the expat community.
Exactly. And I've been told that in Comoros, the language barrier can be quite significant, especially for foreigners who don't speak Comorian or French. But I'm sure our listeners living in Comoros would agree that the locals are generally very friendly and willing to help.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes Comoros so charming. The people are incredibly warm and welcoming. But I'm curious, Leo, have you ever tried to communicate in Com or Ian?
Well, I've tried my best, but let's just say it's not exactly a language I'm familiar with. I've been known to butcher the pronunciation, and the locals always laugh at me.
I can imagine. But in all seriousness, I think it's great that you're making an effort to learn the local language. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any tips on how to communicate effectively in Comoros.
Well, I think the key is to be patient and respectful. And, of course, learn a few basic phrases in Comorian, like bonjour and merci.
That's a great start. Leo, and I think it's also worth mentioning that in Saudi Arabia, the language barrier can be significant, especially for women who wear the hijab and may not be able to communicate with men.
Yes, that's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that in Saudi Arabia, there are some cultural norms around communication, like the use of honorific titles in formal language.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes communication in Saudi Arabia so fascinating, the complex blend of traditional and modern norms.
Absolutely. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that navigating these cultural norms can be a challenge, but also a rewarding experience.
I'm curious, Leo, have you ever had any interesting experiences with communication in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I once tried to order a coffee in Arabic, and the barista laughed at me and said, "You're speaking like a tourist."
Oh, that's hilarious. But I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any tips on how to communicate effectively in Saudi Arabia.
Well, I think the key is to be respectful and patient, and to learn a few basic phrases in Arabic, like shukran and mia, as salame.
That's a great start. Leo! And I think it's also worth mentioning that in Comoros, the language barrier can be significant, especially for foreigners who don't speak Comorian or French.
Yes, that's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that in Comoros, there are some cultural norms around communication, like the use of formal language and honorific titles.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes communication in Comoros so fascinating, the blend of traditional and modern norms.
Absolutely. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that navigating these cultural norms can be a challenge, but also a rewarding experience.
I'm curious, Leo, have you ever had any interesting experiences with communication in Comoros?
Well, I once tried to ask for directions in Comorian, and the local laughed at me and said, "You're speaking like a baby."
Oh, that's hilarious. But I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any tips on how to communicate effectively in Comoros.
Well, I think the key is to be patient and respectful, and to learn a few basic phrases in Comorian, like bonjour and merci.
That's a great start. Leo! And I think it's also worth mentioning that in Saudi Arabia, the language barrier can be significant, especially for foreigners who don't speak Arabic.
Yes, that's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that in Saudi Arabia, there are some cultural norms around communication, like the use of honorific titles in formal language.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes communication in Saudi Arabia so fascinating, the complex blend of traditional and modern norms.
Absolutely. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that navigating these cultural norms can be a challenge, but also a rewarding experience.
I'm curious, Leo, Have you ever had any interesting experiences with communication in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I once tried to communicate with a Saudi friend using only gestures, and we ended up having a great conversation without speaking a word.
Oh, that's amazing. But I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any tips on how to communicate effectively in Saudi Arabia.
Well, I think the key is to be respectful and patient, and to learn a few basic phrases in Arabic, like shukran and maya salame.
That's a great start, Leo. And I think it's also worth mentioning that in Comoros, the language barrier can be significant, especially for foreigners who don't speak Comorian or French.
Yes, that's a great point, Mia. And I think it's also worth noting that in Comoros, there are some cultural norms around communication, like the use of formal language and honorific titles.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes communication in Comoros so fascinating, the blend of traditional and modern norms.
Absolutely. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that navigating these cultural norms can be a challenge, but also a rewarding experience.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever had any interesting experiences with communication in Comoros?
Well, I once tried to communicate with a Comorian friend using only gestures, and we ended up having a great conversation without speaking a word.
Oh, that's amazing. But I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any tips on how to communicate effectively in Comoros.
Well, I think the key is to.
Let's dive into Comoros and Saudi Arabia, two countries with unique cultural landscapes. Comoros, an archipelago off the coast of East Africa, boasts a rich blend of African, Arab, and Asian influences. In contrast, Saudi Arabia, a major player in the Middle East, has a predominantly Islamic culture with a strong emphasis on tradition and hospitality.
Hospitality, a trait that's often on display in Saudi Arabia, but also present in Comoros. In fact, visitors to Comoros often comment on the warm welcome they receive from the locals. The Comorans are known for their generosity and respect for guests.
That's fascinating. And what about social harmony initiatives in Comoros? I'm curious to know how the country promotes unity among its diverse population.
Well, Comoros has made significant strides in promoting social cohesion through education and cultural events. The government has also implemented programs to promote the country's unique cultural heritage, such as the preservation of traditional music and dance.
I'm sure our listeners living in Comoros would agree that the country's cultural diversity is one of its greatest strengths. In Saudi Arabia, there are some challenges related to cultural tolerance. Can you tell us more about that, Leo?
Yes. Well, Saudi Arabia is known for its strict adherence to Islamic law. There are also efforts underway to promote cultural tolerance and understanding. For example, the country has established programs to promote interfaith dialogue and cultural exchange.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm curious to know more about the experiences of expats living in Saudi Arabia. Do they find it easy to adapt to the local culture?
Well, it can be a challenge, but many expats have reported a warm welcome from the Saudi people. Of course, there are also cultural differences that can be difficult to navigate, such as the strict dress code and social norms.
I'm sure our listeners who have lived in Saudi Arabia can relate to that. And what about Comoros? How do the locals view expats and foreigners in general?
In Comoros, foreigners are generally welcome, and the locals are known for their hospitality. However, there may be some cultural differences that expats need to be aware of, such as the importance of respect for elders and tradition.
That's really interesting. I'm curious to know more about the role of women in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. How do the two countries compare in terms of women's rights and empowerment?
Well, Comoros has made significant progress in promoting women's rights and empowerment, with women holding key positions in government and society. In Saudi Arabia, however, women's rights are more limited, although there are efforts underway to promote greater equality and opportunities for women.
I'm sure our listeners are aware of the significant cultural and social differences between Comoros and Saudi Arabia. But what about the potential for cultural exchange and understanding between the two countries?
I think there's a lot of potential for cultural exchange and understanding between Comoros and Saudi Arabia. Both countries have a rich cultural heritage, and there are many opportunities for collaboration and learning.
I agree. Leo. And finally, I'd like to ask our listeners what they think about cultural diversity and tolerance in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. Do you have any personal experiences or insights to share?
Well, I'm sure our listeners will have a lot to say on this topic. And who knows, maybe one day we'll have a cultural exchange program between Comoros and Saudi Arabia.
That's a great idea. Leo! And who knows, maybe one day we'll visit Comoros and Saudi Arabia together and experience their unique cultures firsthand.
Oh, that would be an adventure.
So, let's talk about Comoros and Saudi Arabia. Two countries with unique educational opportunities and language schools. Comoros, being a French and Arab-influenced country, has a bilingual education system. Students learn both French and Arabic, which is fascinating.
That's a great point. Mira, and Saudi Arabia, being a country with a rich Islamic heritage, has a strong emphasis on Islamic education. But I'm curious, how do these countries handle language acquisition for foreign students?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. In Comoros, I've heard that the French language is widely spoken, especially among the educated population. However, Arabic is the official language, and students learn it from a young age.
I've noticed that Saudi Arabia also has a strong focus on Arabic language and culture. But how do they make it accessible to foreign students who may not be fluent in Arabic?
Well, Leo, Comoros has a relatively low literacy rate, but the government is making efforts to improve education. They're also promoting Arabic language learning through various programs and initiatives.
That's interesting. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, has a high literacy rate, but the education system is quite strict. I'm not sure how they balance the need for Islamic education with the need for modern language skills.
I think that's a great point. Leo! And speaking of language skills, have you noticed how important English language proficiency is becoming in both countries?
Oh, absolutely. In Saudi Arabia, English is becoming increasingly important, especially in business and tourism. But how do you think Comoros can improve its English language skills?
Well, Leo, I've heard that Comoros has a growing expat community, and they're making efforts to promote English language learning through language schools and programs.
That's great to hear. I'm curious. Mira, what do you think are the biggest challenges facing language acquisition in Comoros and Saudi Arabia?
That's a tough question, Leo. But I think one of the biggest challenges is the lack of resources and infrastructure. Both countries need more language schools and programs to support language acquisition.
I agree. And I think another challenge is the cultural and linguistic differences between the two countries. How do you think they can bridge that gap?
That's a great question. Leah, I think they can start by promoting cultural exchange programs and language immersion experiences. That way, students can learn about each other's cultures and languages in a more practical way.
I see what you mean. And speaking of cultural exchange, have you noticed how important it is for students to learn about different cultures and languages?
Oh, absolutely. It's essential for students to understand and appreciate different cultures and languages. And I think that's something that both Comoros and Saudi Arabia are working towards.
I agree. And I think that's a great note to end on. I'm curious. Mira, what do you think our listeners would say about the educational opportunities and language schools in Comoros and Saudi Arabia?
Well, Leo, I think our listeners would say that both countries have a lot to offer. But they also face unique challenges. And I think that's something we can all learn from.
Well said. Nia, and I think that's a great conclusion to our topic. Let's move on to our next topic and see what other fascinating conversations we can have.
Sounds good to me. Leah, and to our listeners, I'm curious, have you had any experiences with language acquisition in Comoros or Saudi Arabia? Share your stories with us in the comments below.
And I land. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating conversations about educational opportunities on language schools around the world.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone, and until next time, stay curious and keep learning.
And remember, language acquisition is key to unlocking new opportunities and experiences. Keep learning and keep exploring.
Dive into the climate and seasonal conditions of Comoros and Saudi Arabia. I'm sure our listeners living in these countries would agree with me that the weather can be quite extreme at times.
That's an understatement. I've seen some crazy temperature fluctuations in both countries. Comoros, for instance, has a tropical climate with high humidity, while Saudi Arabia has a hot desert climate with very little rainfall.
Exactly. And have you noticed how the locals adapt to these conditions? In Comoros, people wear lightweight clothing and stay hydrated. While in Saudi Arabia, they wear traditional attire and use air conditioning to cope with the heat.
Yeah, it's amazing how they've learned to live with these conditions. But what about extreme weather events? I've heard that Comoros is prone to cyclones, while Saudi Arabia experiences sandstorms and heat waves.
That's right. Comoros is located in the Indian Ocean, which makes it vulnerable to cyclones. But Saudi Arabia's sandstorms can be just as intense, especially during the summer months.
I can imagine. I've seen pictures of sandstorms covering entire cities. But what about the impact of climate change on these countries? I'm sure our listeners would be interested in knowing how rising temperatures and changing weather patterns are affecting the environment.
Great point. Climate change is a huge concern for both countries. Comoros is experiencing more frequent and severe cyclones, while Saudi Arabia is dealing with rising temperatures and more frequent storms.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. But what about the local adaptations? I've heard that Comoros is investing in renewable energy, while Saudi Arabia is developing new technologies to reduce its carbon footprint.
That's correct. Comoros is indeed investing in solar and wind power, while Saudi Arabia is focusing on green technologies like green buildings and sustainable transportation.
Wow, it's great to see these countries taking proactive steps to address climate change. But what about the impact on daily life? I'm sure our listeners would be interested in knowing how the climate affects their daily routines.
Great question. The climate definitely affects daily life in both countries. In Comoros, people often plan their activities around the weather, while in Saudi Arabia, the heat can make even simple tasks like walking or shopping feel like a chore.
Yeah, it's amazing how the climate can shape our daily habits. But what about the cultural significance of the climate? I've heard that the climate plays a big role in shaping the culture and traditions of both countries.
That's absolutely right. The climate has a huge impact on the culture and traditions of both countries. In Comoros, the climate influences the local cuisine, music, and art, while in Saudi Arabia, the climate shapes the architecture, clothing, and even the social norms.
Wow, it's amazing how the climate can shape our culture and traditions. But what about the tourism industry? I'm sure our listeners would be interested in knowing how the climate affects tourism in both countries.
Great point. The climate definitely affects tourism in both countries. In Comoros, the climate makes it an ideal destination for beach lovers and adventure seekers, while in Saudi Arabia, the climate makes it a popular destination for pilgrims and sightseers.
Yeah, it's amazing how the climate can shape our travel plans. But what about the future? I'm sure our listeners would be interested in knowing how these countries are preparing for the impacts of climate change.
Great question. Both Comoros and Saudi Arabia are taking steps to prepare for the impacts of climate change. Comoros is investing in climate-resilient infrastructure, while Saudi Arabia is developing new technologies to reduce its carbon footprint.
Wow, it's great to see these countries taking proactive steps to address climate change. And that's all for this topic. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the climate and seasonal conditions of Comoros and Saudi Arabia.
Comoros is known for its unique blend of African, Arab, and Asian flavors. Imagine a fusion of Indian spices, African grilled meats, and Middle Eastern dates. It's a culinary melting pot that will leave you craving for more.
That sounds incredible. I'm sure our listeners are already salivating at the thought of trying Comorian cuisine. But let's not forget about Saudi Arabia's rich food culture, which is deeply rooted in its Islamic heritage. The country is famous for its hospitality, and meal times are always a time for social bonding and sharing stories.
I love how food brings people together, whether it's in Comoros or Saudi Arabia. But have you ever tried the traditional Comorian dish? Pilaf? It's a flavorful rice dish cooked with spices, herbs, and sometimes even meat or seafood.
Pilaf sounds delicious. And in Saudi Arabia, we have our own version of a flavorful rice dish called kayatsa. It's a hearty meal made with a mixture of sautéed meat, onions, and spices, served over a bed of rice.
Kayatsa is indeed a popular dish in Saudi Arabia, but I'm curious to know more about the unique ingredients used in Indian cuisine. For example, have you heard of cassava? It's a staple crop in Comoros and is often used in traditional dishes like cassava fufu.
Cassava is an interesting ingredient, and I can see why it's a staple in Comoros. But in Saudi Arabia, we have our own unique ingredients like dates, which are used in a variety of dishes, including desserts and savory meals.
Dates are indeed a staple in Saudi Arabian cuisine. But I'm curious to know more about the traditional Comorian dessert. Mai fi. It's a sweet and spicy paste made from dates, coconut milk, and spices.
Mai fi sounds like a fascinating dessert, and I'm sure our listeners would love to try it. But let's not forget about the importance of nutrition in both Comoros and Saudi Arabia. What are some of the traditional Comorian dishes that are high in nutrients and low in calories?
That's a great question. One of the traditional Comorian dishes that comes to mind is bambao, which is a fish dish cooked with spices and herbs. It's a great source of protein and omega-3 fatty acids.
Bambao? Oh, sounds like a delicious and nutritious dish. But I'm sure our listeners are curious to know more about the traditional Saudi Arabian dishes that are high in nutrients and low in calories. For example, what about kebab? It's a popular dish made with marinated meat, served over a bed of rice or vegetables.
Kebab is indeed a popular dish in Saudi Arabia, but I'm curious to know more about the unique ingredients used in Comorian cuisine. For example, have you heard of coconut milk? It's the staple ingredient in Comoros and is often used in traditional dishes like fish curry.
Coconut milk is an interesting ingredient, and I can see why it's a staple in Comoros. But in Saudi Arabia, we have our own unique ingredients like tahini, which is a paste made from sesame seeds and is often used in traditional dishes like hummus.
Tahini is indeed a staple in Saudi Arabian cuisine, but I'm curious to know more about the traditional Ian dishes that are perfect for vegetarians and vegans. For example, have you heard of cassava leaves? They're a staple ingredient in Comoros and are often used in traditional dishes like cassava leaf soup.
Cassava leaves are an interesting ingredient, and I can see why they're a staple in Comoros. But in Saudi Arabia, we have our own unique ingredients like olive oil, which is a staple in many traditional dishes.
Olive oil is indeed a staple in Saudi Arabian cuisine. But I'm curious to know more about the traditional Comorian dishes that are perfect for those who follow a gluten-free diet. For example, have you heard of rice porridge? It's a traditional Comorian dish made with rice and spices, and is often served as a breakfast option.
Rice porridge is a great option for those who follow a gluten-free diet, and I'm sure our listeners would love to try it. But let's not forget about the importance of food safety in both Comoros and Saudi Arabia. What are some of the traditional Comorian dishes that are made with raw ingredients? And how can they be safely prepared?
That's a great question. One of the traditional Comorian dishes that comes to mind is fish fry, which is a raw fish dish cooked with spices and herbs. It's a great source of protein and omega-3 fatty acids, but it requires careful preparation to avoid foodborne illness.
Fish fry is indeed a traditional Comorian dish, But I'm sure our listeners are curious to know more about the traditional Saudi Arabian dishes that are made with raw ingredients. For example, what about kibach? It's a popular dish made with raw meat, served over a bed of rice or vegetables.
Kibach is indeed a popular dish in Saudi Arabia, but I'm curious to know more about the unique ingredients used in Comorian cuisine. For example, have you heard of coconut oil? It's a staple ingredient in Comoros and is often used in traditional dishes like coconut rice.
Coconut oil is an interesting ingredient, and I can see why it's a staple in Comoros. But in Saudi Arabia, we have our own unique ingredients like ghee, which is a type of clarified butter often used in traditional dishes.
Ghee is indeed a staple in Saudi Arabian cuisine. But I'm curious to know more about the traditional Comorian dishes that are perfect for those who follow a lactose-free diet. For example, have you heard of cassava cake? It's a traditional Comorian dessert made with cassava flour and spices.
Cassava cake is a great option for those who follow a lactose-free diet, and I'm sure our listeners would love to try it. But let's not forget about the importance of preserving traditional food cultures in both Comoros and Saudi Arabia. What are some of the initiatives that are being taken to preserve traditional Comorian and Saudi Arabian cuisine?
That's a great question. One of the initiatives that comes to mind is the Comorian Food Festival, which is held annually in Moroni, the capital city of Comoros. The festival showcases traditional Comorian cuisine and brings together food enthusiasts from all over the world.
The Comorian Food Festival sounds like a fantastic event, and I'm sure our listeners would love to attend it. But let's not forget about the importance of food security in both Comoros and Saudi Arabia. What are some of the traditional Comorian and Saudi Arabian dishes that are high in nutrients and low in calories?
I'm so to dive into the rich historical and cultural heritage of Comoros and Saudi Arabia. Jet off. AI loves uncovering stories like this, and so do we. Let's start with Comoros, an island nation off the coast of East Africa. Who would have thought that this tiny country has such a vibrant history?
That's right. Mira, Comoros has a fascinating history, from its ancient trade routes to its colonial past. And did you know that Comoros is home to the ancient city of Dumoni? It's an archaeological site that dates back to the 10th century.
Wow, that's amazing. I can just imagine the bustling markets and trading ships of the past. And speaking of trade, Comoros has a long history of being a hub for merchants and traders. It's no wonder that jet off. A has so many resources on the history of Comoros.
Well, we're glad to have those resources, Mira. But seriously, Comoros has a unique cultural identity that's shaped by its African, Arabic, and French influences. And have you seen the beautiful mosques in Comoros? They're stunning examples of Islamic architecture.
Oh, yes. The mosques in Comoros are breathtaking. And I'm sure our listeners living in Comoros would agree with me that the country's cultural heritage is a rich tapestry of traditions and customs. What about Saudi Arabia? Leah? How does its cultural heritage compare to Comoros?
Saudi Arabia has a rich cultural heritage, too. From its ancient cities like Riyadh to its modern-day museums like the King Fahd Library. Saudi Arabia has a lot to offer. And did you know that Saudi Arabia has a unique tradition of calligraphy? It's an art form that dates back to the 8th century.
Wow, that's incredible. I had no idea that calligraphy was such an important part of Saudi Arabian culture. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. Perhaps we can even share some examples of Saudi Arabian calligraphy on our next podcast episode.
That's a great idea. Mira, and speaking of art, Comoros has its own unique art scene. From traditional wood carvings to modern paintings, Comoros has a rich cultural heritage that's worth exploring. And did you know that Jet Off has a collection of Comorian art on its platform?
Oh, really? That's amazing. I'd love to see some examples of Comorian art. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate it too. Perhaps we can even feature some Comorian artists on our podcast in the future.
That's a great idea. Mira, and finally, Let's talk about the festivals and traditions of both countries. Comoros has its own unique festivals like the Comorian National Day, while Saudi Arabia has its own unique traditions like the Umrah pilgrimage.
Oh yes, the Umrah pilgrimage is such an important part of Saudi Arabian culture, and I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. Perhaps we can even share some stories about the Umrah pilgrimage on our next podcast episode.
That's a great idea. Mira! And finally, I'd like to say that both Comoros and Saudi Arabia have so much to offer in terms of historical, cultural, and artistic values, from their ancient landmarks to their vibrant art scenes. Both countries have a rich cultural heritage that's worth exploring.
Well said, Leo. And I think we've just scratched the surface of what these two countries have to offer. Thanks to Jetoff AI for providing us with such valuable resources on the history and culture of Comoros and Saudi Arabia.
Yes, thank you. Get off. AI. And to our listeners, I'm curious, what do you think about the cultural heritage of Comoros and Saudi Arabia? Do you have any favorite festivals or traditions from either country? Let us know in the comments.
Hey, have you guys ever heard of Comoros? It's an island nation off the coast of East Africa. And let me tell you, it's got some of the most stunning beaches I've ever seen.
Ah, Comoros? I think I've heard of it, but I've never been. From what I've seen, it's like a tropical paradise with crystal clear waters and coral reefs.
Exactly. And the best part is, it's still relatively off the beaten path, so you can experience that pristine beach vibe without all the crowds. I'm certain that our listeners living in Comoros would agree with me.
Yeah, maybe. But let's move on to our next country, Saudi Arabia. I mean, who wouldn't want to visit a country with the world's largest desert, right?
Right. And speaking of deserts, have you guys ever heard of the Enti Quarter in Saudi Arabia? It's this massive desert that covers over 600 square kilometers.
Wow, that's huge. And I've heard it's not just any ordinary desert. It's like a vast, endless expanse of sand dunes that stretch as far as the eye can see.
Exactly. And the best part is, it's not just about the sand. The Enti Quarter is also home to some of the most ancient and mysterious rock formations in the world.
Ah, I've heard of those. They're like ancient fossils from the bygone era, right?
Yeah, something like that. But let's get back to Comoros for a minute. Have you guys ever heard of the Valley de Mangroves?
No, I don't think so. But I'm sure it's not as boring as the name sounds.
Trust me, it's not boring. The Valley de Mangroves is this stunning mangrove forest that's home to all sorts of wildlife, from monkeys to sea turtles.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure the views are just breathtaking.
Exactly. And speaking of views, have you guys ever seen the sunset over the Indian Ocean in Comoros?
No, I don't think so. But I'm sure it's not as romantic as you're making it sound.
Boo, come on. The sunsets in Comoros are just incredible. And the best part is, you can experience them from the comfort of a beautiful beach resort.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a real treat. But let's get back to Saudi Arabia for a minute. I've heard that the country is home to some of the most ancient and historic cities in the world.
Ah, yes. And speaking of history, have you guys ever heard of the ancient city of Diriyah?
Yes, I have. It's like a UNESCO World Heritage Site, right?
Exactly. And it's not just any ordinary city. Diriyah is like a treasure trove of history and culture, with ancient palaces and fortresses that date back centuries.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure the views are just stunning.
Trust me, they are. But let's not forget about Comoros. Have you guys ever heard of the Karthala volcano?
No, I don't think so. But I'm sure it's not as boring as the name sounds.
Oh, it's not boring. I promise. The Karthala volcano is like a majestic mountain that towers over the island, with stunning views of the surrounding landscape.
Wow, that sounds breathtaking. And I'm sure the adventure opportunities are just endless.
Exactly. And speaking of adventure, have you guys ever tried scuba diving in Comoros?
No, I don't think so. But I'm sure it's not as scary as it sounds.
Oh, it's not scary. I promise. Scuba diving in Comoros is like a dream come true. With crystal clear waters and incredible array of marine life.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure the views are just stunning.
Trust me, they are. But let's get back to Saudi Arabia for a minute. I've heard that the country is home to some of the most incredible natural wonders in the world.
Ah, yes. And speaking of natural wonders, have you guys ever heard of the red sand dunes in Saudi Arabia?
Yes, I have. They're like a surreal landscape that's just breathtaking.
Exactly. And the best part is, the red sand dunes are not just any ordinary sand dunes. They're like a natural wonder that's been shaped by the wind and the sand over thousands of years.
Well, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure the views are just stunning.
Yeah, I'm sure they are. But let's not forget about Comoros. Have you guys ever heard of the NEOM waterfall?
No, I don't think so. But I'm sure it's not as boring as the name sounds.
Oh, it's not boring. I promise. The NEOM waterfall is like a majestic waterfall that cascades down a rocky cliff, with stunning views of the surrounding landscape.
Wow, that sounds breathtaking. And I'm sure the adventure opportunities are just endless.
Exactly. And speaking of adventure, have you guys ever tried hiking in Comoros?
No, I don't think so. But I'm sure it's not as scary as it sounds.
Oh, it's not scary. I promise. Hiking in Comoros is like a dream come true, with stunning views of the surrounding landscape and an incredible array of wildlife.
Well, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure the views are just stunning.
Yeah. I'm sure they are. But let's get back to Saudi Arabia for a minute. I've heard that the country is home to some of the most incredible natural wonders in the world.
Ah, yes. And speaking of natural wonders, have you guys ever heard of the ylang-ylang?
Yes, I have. They're like an ancient city that's been hidden away for centuries, with stunning views of the surrounding landscape.
Exactly. And the best part is, the Al-Ula ruins are not just any ordinary ancient city. They're like a treasure trove of history and culture, with ancient palaces and fortresses that date back centuries.
Wow, that.
I'm to dive into the world of sports and adventure options in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. Let's start with Comoros, where I'm told that the locals are quite passionate about sports, especially soccer.
Ah, yes. Soccer is a big deal in Comoros. But did you know that they also have a strong tradition of wrestling? In fact, it's a popular form of entertainment in the country. And it's not just for the locals.
That's fascinating. I'm curious, how does one even become a professional wrestler in Comoros? Do they have training programs, or is it more of a, well, let's say, a learn-as-you-go kind of thing?
Well, it's a bit of both, actually. The wrestlers in Comoros are often trained by experienced wrestlers, but it's also a matter of natural talent and a willingness to take risks. And trust me, it's not for the faint of heart.
I can imagine. And what about Saudi Arabia? I've heard that they have a more, let's say, conservative approach to sports and recreation.
Ah, yes. Saudi Arabia does have some unique challenges when it comes to sports and recreation, but they're also making great strides in promoting physical activity and sports tourism. For example, have you heard about the Red Sands Desert Run?
No, I haven't. Tell me more about it. Is it a popular event?
Yes, it's a big deal in Saudi Arabia, and it's actually one of the largest desert runs in the world. It's a 160-kilometer run through the stunning sand dunes of the Red Sands Desert. And it's an incredible experience for runners and spectators alike.
Well, that sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners who are into running or hiking would love to hear more about it. And what about Comoros? Do they have any similar events or activities?
Yes. Comoros has a few different events and activities that are similar to the Red Sands Desert Run. For example, they have an annual marathon that takes place in the capital city of Moroni. And it's a great way to experience the local culture and scenery.
That sounds great. And what about adventure sports? Are there any opportunities for skydiving, bungee jumping, or rock climbing in Comoros or Saudi Arabia?
Ah, yes. Both countries have some amazing opportunities for adventure sports. In Comoros, you can go skydiving or bungee jumping over the beautiful islands. And in Saudi Arabia, you can go rock climbing in the stunning sandstone cliffs of the Red Sands Desert.
Whoa, that sounds intense. I'm sure our listeners who are thrill seekers would love to hear more about it. And what about team sports? Are there any popular team sports in Comoros or Saudi Arabia?
Ah, yes. Both countries have some popular team sports. In Comoros, they have a strong tradition of basketball. And in Saudi Arabia, they have a big following for soccer and volleyball.
That's great to hear. And what about outdoor activities? Are there any opportunities for hiking, camping, or bird watching in Comoros or Saudi Arabia?
Ah, yes. Both countries have some amazing opportunities for outdoor activities. In Comoros, you can hike through the beautiful islands and forests. And in Saudi Arabia, you can go camping in the stunning desert landscapes.
That sounds wonderful. I'm sure our listeners who love the outdoors would love to hear more about it. And finally, what about the cultural aspect of sports and recreation in Comoros and Saudi Arabia? Are there any unique traditions or customs that are worth mentioning?
Ah, yes. Both countries have some amazing cultural traditions and customs when it comes to sports and recreation. For example, in Comoros, they have a strong tradition of music and dance during sports events. And in Saudi Arabia, they have a unique tradition of hospitality and generosity towards visitors and athletes.
That's so cool. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. Well, that's all the time we have for today's topic. But we'll definitely be back with more exciting stories and adventures from around the world.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. And don't forget to follow us on social media for more updates and behind-the-scenes peeks into our podcast.
I'm curious, have you ever been to Comoros? I've heard it's a hidden gem when it comes to nightlife.
Actually, I've been to the Comoros Islands. And while it's true they have a laid-back vibe, the nightlife scene is more low-key. You won't find many clubs or bars, but the locals love to gather at the beachside restaurants and enjoy some live music.
That sounds lovely. I've always been a fan of beachside gatherings, but I'm sure our listeners living in Saudi Arabia might have a different perspective on nightlife. Leo, what do you think about the nightlife scene in Saudi Arabia?
Well, Saudi Arabia has a more vibrant nightlife scene compared to Comoros, but it's still relatively conservative. You'll find more upscale bars and clubs in major cities like Riyadh and Jeddah, but they tend to be more exclusive and geared towards the expat community.
I see. So it sounds like both countries have their own unique approach to nightlife. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried to attend a traditional Calm or Ian celebration?
Ah, yes. I tried to join in on a traditional Calm or Ian dance, but let's just say I'm not as flexible as the locals.
I can imagine. But seriously, Leo, I think it's great that you're trying to immerse yourself in the local culture. And speaking of immersion, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the traditional entertainment venues in Comoros. Leo, can you tell us a bit more about that?
Of course. In Comoros, you'll find traditional entertainment venues like the Majlis, which is a community gathering space where locals come together to socialize and enjoy music and dance. It's a great way to experience the local culture and get a glimpse into the traditional way of life.
That sounds fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the modern entertainment venues in Saudi Arabia. Leo, what do you think about the state of entertainment in Saudi Arabia?
Well, Saudi Arabia has made significant strides in recent years to develop its entertainment industry. You'll find modern venues like the Red Bull Arena in Riyadh, which hosts concerts and events, and the City Walk in Jeddah, which offers a more laid-back atmosphere with live music and street food.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the festivals and events in Comoros. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Ah, yes. Comoros has a rich cultural calendar, with festivals and events like the Fête de la Musique and the Comoros International Film Festival. These events showcase the local music, dance, and film talent, and are a great way to experience the island's vibrant culture.
That sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the festivals and events in Saudi Arabia. Leo, what do you think about the state of festivals in Saudi Arabia?
Well, Saudi Arabia has a more established festival scene compared to Comoros. You'll find festivals like the Riyadh Season and the Jeddah International Festival, which showcase the country's rich cultural heritage and offer a range of entertainment options.
I see. So it sounds like both countries have their own unique approach to festivals and events. And speaking of unique, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local music scene in Comoros. Leah, can you tell us a bit more about that?
Of course. In Comoros, you'll find a rich musical heritage, with traditional genres like the MWADZ, I and the Zeal is Opere. These genres are characterized by their unique rhythms and melodies, and are a great way to experience the local culture.
That sounds fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local music scene in Saudi Arabia. Leo, what do you think about the state of music in Saudi Arabia?
Well, Saudi Arabia has a more developed music scene compared to Comoros. You'll find a range of musical genres, from traditional Arabic music to modern styles like hip-hop and pop. The country has also seen a surge in local music talent, with artists like Majd Al-Salah and Olan.
I see. So it sounds like both countries have their own unique approach to music. And speaking of unique, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the traditional dance in Comoros. Leo, can you tell us a bit more about that?
Of course. In Comoros, you'll find traditional dances like the MWADZ is Opere, which are characterized by their unique movements and rhythms. These dances are a great way to experience the local culture and get a glimpse into the traditional way of life.
That sounds fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the modern dance scene in Saudi Arabia. Leo, what do you think about the state of dance in Saudi Arabia?
Well, Saudi Arabia has a more developed dance scene compared to Comoros. You'll find a range of dance styles, from traditional Arabic dance to modern styles like hip-hop and contemporary. The country has also seen a surge in local dance talent, with artists like Fairs, Al-Suwa Idayan Dayman Al-Hindi.
I see. So it sounds like both countries have their own unique approach to dance. And speaking of unique, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the nightlife scene in Comoros. Leo, can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes. The nightlife scene in Comoros is more laid back, with a focus on beachside gatherings and live music. You'll find more bars and clubs in major cities like Moroni and Defo and Boni, but they tend to be more low-key compared to Saudi Arabia.
I see. So it sounds like both countries have their own unique approach to nightlife. And speaking of unique, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the nightlife scene in Saudi Arabia. Leo, what do you think about the state of nightlife in Saudi Arabia?
Well, Saudi Arabia has a more vibrant nightlife scene compared to Comoros, with a focus on upscale bars and clubs in major cities like Riyadh and Jeddah. However, it's still relatively conservative, and you'll find more exclusive venues geared towards the expat community.
I see. So, it sounds like both countries have their own unique approach to nightlife. And speaking of unique, I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried to attend a traditional Saudi Arabian celebration?
Oh, yes. I tried to join in on a traditional Saudi Arabian dance. But let's just say I'm not as flexible as the locals.
I can imagine. But seriously, and to dive into family-friendly environments and children's activities in Comoros and Saudi Arabia, let's start with Comoros, where I've heard the beaches are stunning and the locals are incredibly welcoming. Have you ever been to Comoros? Leo?
Actually, Mira, I haven't had the chance to visit Comoros yet, but I've heard great things about its beautiful islands and vibrant culture. From what I know, Comoros is a great destination for families, with plenty of opportunities for kids to learn about the local environment and culture.
Exactly. Comoros has a strong focus on family and community, which is reflected in its many friendly activities and events. For example, the island of Ngozi DJI has a beautiful national park that's perfect for hiking and exploring with kids. And have you heard about Accom or Ian cuisine? Leo? It's amazing.
Yes, I've heard that Comorian cuisine is a fusion of Africa and Asian flavors, and it sounds delicious. I'm sure our listeners who have visited Comoros would agree that the food is a highlight of the trip. But what about Saudi Arabia? Mira, how does it compare in terms of family-friendly activities?
Well, Leo, Arabia is a bit of a different story, but it's definitely becoming more family-friendly in recent years. One of the best places to visit with kids is the Al Faiz Aliyah Tower in Riyadh, which offers stunning views of the city and a great kids' play area. And have you heard about the Saudi government's initiatives to promote family-friendly tourism?
Yes, I've heard that the Saudi government is working to create more family destinations and activities, including theme parks and water parks. It's great to see them investing in tourism infrastructure that caters to families. But what about the cultural aspect? Mira, how do the locals in Saudi Arabia view family and children?
Oh, that's a great question. Leo, in Saudi Arabia, family is highly valued, and children are considered a blessing. In fact, the country has a strong tradition of family gatherings and celebrations, particularly during holidays like Eid al-Fitr. And have you noticed, Leo, that the Saudi government has also launched initiatives to promote reading and literacy among children?
Yes, I've seen that the Saudi government is promoting reading and literacy through various programs and events, including the annual Riyadh International Book Fair. It's great to see them investing in education and literacy, especially among children. But what about the role of women in Saudi Arabia? Mira, how do they balance family and work responsibilities?
Oh, that's a great question. Leo, in Saudi Arabia, women play a vital role in family life, and many are also pursuing careers and education. There are still challenges for women in the workforce, particularly in terms of work-life balance. But overall, I think Saudi Arabia is making progress in terms of family-friendly policies and initiatives.
I agree. Mira, it's great to see Saudi Arabia working to create a more family-friendly environment, despite the challenges. And speaking of challenges, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear about any tips or advice for visiting Comoros and Saudi Arabia with kids. Do you have any tips? Mira?
Actually, Leah, I do have a few tips. For Comoros, I recommend visiting the island of Moroni, which has some of the most beautiful beaches and crystal clear waters. And for Saudi Arabia, I suggest visiting the Al Mazmak fortress in Riyadh, which is a great place for kids to learn about history and culture.
Great tips, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any additional advice or recommendations for visiting these countries with kids. Do you have any final thoughts or recommendations, Mira?
Well, Leo, I think the most important thing for families visiting Comoros and Saudi Arabia is to be open-minded and flexible. Both countries have their unique cultures and traditions, and being respectful of these is key. And don't forget to try the local cuisine, which is delicious.
I couldn't agree more, Mira. And I think our listeners would agree that Comoros and Saudi Arabia are both great destinations for families, despite the challenges. Thanks for sharing your insights and recommendations. Mira.
No problem. Leah, it's been a pleasure chatting with you about family-friendly environments and children's activities in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. And to our listeners, don't forget to share your own experiences and recommendations in the comments below.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more travel tips and recommendations, including our next episode on 19, Nightlife in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. Stay curious and keep exploring.
Don't forget to check out our social media channels for more updates and behind-the-scenes peeks into our travels. And if you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, please let us know in the comments.
And finally, I'd like to ask our listeners what's the most family-friendly destination you've ever visited. Share your stories and recommendations with us, and we might feature them in a future episode.
Thanks for the vote of confidence, Leo. And to our listeners, don't forget to tune in next time for more travel tips and recommendations. Until then, stay curious and keep exploring. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think about the LGBT-friendly atmosphere in Comoros? Have you heard about their vibrant pride events?
Actually, I was just reading about Comoros' efforts to promote inclusivity and acceptance. It's interesting to see how they're working towards creating a more welcoming environment for the LGBT community. But I have to ask, Mira, have you ever been to a pride event in Comoros?
Well, I haven't, but I've heard it's a wonderful experience. The Comorians are known for their warm hospitality, and I'm sure they'd be more than happy to welcome us with open arms. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think Comoros is doing enough to promote LGBT rights?
That's a great question. Mira, I think what's most impressive about Comoros is their willingness to learn and adapt. They're not afraid to take on new ideas and challenge traditional norms. But, of course, there's still a long way to go. I mean, have you seen the laws in Comoros regarding same-sex relationships? It's not exactly progressive, shall we say.
Oh, Leo, you're such a diplomat. Yes, I'm aware of the laws, and it's indeed a challenge. But I believe that education and awareness are key to creating a more inclusive society. And who knows, maybe one day Comoros will join the ranks of other African countries that have made significant strides in promoting LGBT rights.
I hope so, Mira. But, in the meantime, let's talk about Saudi Arabia. Now, that's a country that's not exactly known for its LGBT-friendly atmosphere. In fact, it's one of the countries that's been criticized for its harsh treatment of LGBT individuals.
Yes, I agree. Leo, Arabia has a long way to go in terms of promoting LGBT rights. But I think it's essential to acknowledge the cultural context and the complexities of the issue. After all, Saudi Arabia is a country with a rich history and a unique cultural heritage. And who knows, maybe there are pockets of acceptance and inclusivity that we're not aware of.
I'm not so sure about that. Mira, I mean, Saudi Arabia is a country that's deeply rooted in traditional values and Islamic law. And, as you know, the laws regarding same-sex relationships are quite strict. But I suppose it's always possible that there are some individuals or communities that are more open-minded than others.
I love a good debate. Leo, but seriously, I think it's essential to approach this topic with sensitivity and respect. After all, we're talking about human rights and dignity. Who knows? Maybe one day Saudi Arabia will join the ranks of other countries that have made significant strides in promoting LGBT rights.
Well, I'm not holding my breath, Mira, but in all seriousness, I think it's essential to acknowledge the complexities of the issue and to approach it with empathy and understanding. After all, we're not just talking about LGBT rights. We're talking about human rights in general.
Absolutely. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would agree with us. So, let's hear from you. What do you think about the LGBT-friendly atmosphere in Comoros and Saudi Arabia? Do you think there's room for improvement in both countries?
Well, I think that's a great question, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would love to share their thoughts and opinions. So, let's open up the floor and hear from you all.
I'm curious. Have you ever visited a place that just made you feel like you were part of the family from the moment you arrived?
Yes. I think I have. But that was definitely not in Saudi Arabia.
Arabia's hospitality is certainly unique.
Unique is one way to put it. I mean, the concept of DIY in Saudi culture is all about welcoming guests with generosity and respect.
That's right. And I've heard it's not just about food and drink, but also about creating a sense of comfort and familiarity for visitors.
Exactly. And it's not just about the host, but also about the community as a whole.
I've heard that in some parts of Saudi Arabia, You'll even be invited to join the family for meals and celebrations.
Yes, and that's definitely an experience you won't forget.
I bet. So, what do you think makes Saudi hospitality so special?
Well, I think it's because of the strong emphasis on community and family ties.
That's really interesting. I've also heard that in Comoros, the concept of karama is similar to DIY, but it's more about showing respect and kindness to guests.
Yes. I've heard of that too.
And it's not just about the host, but also about the community as a whole.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes Comorian hospitality so unique.
I'm curious, have you ever experienced karama firsthand in Comoros?
Actually, I have. And it was an amazing experience.
That's great to hear. So, what was it like?
Well, my host family took me in and showed me around the island, introducing me to all sorts of wonderful people and customs.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that experience.
Yeah, maybe I'll write a book about it.
I'm sure that would be a bestseller. So, what do you think is the key to making visitors feel welcome in Comoros?
I think it's all about the people. Really.
I agree. I think that's what makes Comoros so special. So warm and welcoming people.
Absolutely.
I'm curious, have you ever tried to learn a few words of the Comorian language?
Well, I've tried, but I'm afraid I'm not very good at it.
Oh, come on. Leo, you're a comedian. You can learn anything.
Yeah, maybe you're right.
I'm sure our listeners would love to hear a few Comorian phrases from you.
Okay, I'll try.
Go on, Leo.
Okay, so, Jumbo means,
I think you mean Jumbo means hello.
yeah, that's right.
And what about Shukran?
Ah, yes, I remember that one. Shukran means,
Come on. Leo, don't leave us hanging.
okay. Shukran means thank you.
That's perfect.
Thanks for helping me out. Mira.
Anytime. So, what do you think is the biggest misconception about Saudi Arabia's hospitality?
I think some people might think that Saudi Arabia is a bit too strict or formal, but I think that's just a surface level impression.
That's a great point. I think that's what makes Saudi Arabia's hospitality so special. The contrast between the formal and the informal.
Exactly.
I'm curious, have you ever experienced any of the more formal aspects of Saudi hospitality?
Well, I did get invited to a traditional Saudi dinner once, and it was definitely an experience.
I bet. So what was it like?
Well, let's just say it was a bit more formal than I was used to.
I'm sure. So, what do you think is the key to making visitors feel welcome in Comoros?
I think it's all about the people. Really.
I agree. I think that's what makes Comoros so special. The warm and welcoming people.
Absolutely.
I'm curious, have you ever tried to learn a few words of the Comorian language?
Well, I've tried, but I'm afraid I'm not very good at it.
Oh, come on. Leo, you're a comedian. You can learn anything.
Yeah, maybe you're right.
I'm sure our listeners would love to hear a few Comorian phrases from you.
Okay, I'll try.
Go on, Leo.
Okay, so, jungle means,
I think you mean Jumbo means hello.
yeah, that's right.
And what about Shukran?
Ah, yes. I remember that one. Shukran means,
Come on, Leo, don't leave us hanging.
okay. Shukran means thank you.
That's perfect.
Thanks for helping me out. Mira.
I'm curious about Comoros, our first country. How does its internet infrastructure compare to other African nations?
Ah, Comoros. A small island nation in the Indian Ocean. Its internet penetration is surprisingly high, considering its size. According to recent reports, around 30% of the population has access to the internet.
That's impressive. I'm sure our listeners living in Comoros would agree that having a reliable internet connection is crucial for daily life.
Indeed. And it's not just about having access to the internet. Comoros is also investing in digital infrastructure, such as fiber optic cables and underwater cables to connect the islands.
Fiber optic cables? That's like having a super fast internet highway. Right. But I'm sure it's not without its challenges.
Exactly. And one of the biggest challenges Comoros faces is the high cost of internet services, making it inaccessible to many rural communities.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried to access the internet from a rural area in Comoros? How was your experience?
Well, Mira, I haven't had the chance to visit Comoros yet, but I've heard it's quite a challenge. And I'm sure our listeners who have experienced it can share their stories in the comments.
That's a great idea. Leo, let's hear from our listeners. Back to Comoros. What about its digital facilities? Are there any notable innovations or initiatives that stand out?
Yes. Comoros is actually investing in e-government initiatives, making it easier for citizens to access public services online.
iGovernment? That's like having a digital one-stop shop for all your government needs. I'm sure our listeners would appreciate that convenience.
Exactly. And it's not just about convenience. iGovernment can also help reduce corruption and improve transparency.
Transparency is key. Indeed. But I'm sure our listeners living in Comoros would agree that there's still a long way to go in terms of digital development.
Absolutely. Mira, and that brings us to our second country, Saudi Arabia. How does its internet infrastructure compare to Comoros?
Saudi Arabia. A country with a vast digital landscape. I'm sure our listeners would agree that Saudi Arabia's internet infrastructure is much more developed than Comoros.
Indeed, Saudi Arabia has made significant investments in digital infrastructure, including the development of smart cities and digital nomad hubs.
Smart cities? That's like having a futuristic city where everything is connected and efficient. I'm sure our listeners would love to experience that.
Exactly. And Saudi Arabia's smart cities are not just about technology. They're also designed to improve the quality of life for citizens.
Quality of life. That's like having a digital upgrade for your daily life. I'm sure our listeners would appreciate that.
Absolutely. Mira. And Saudi Arabia's digital facilities are not just limited to smart cities. The country is also investing in digital entrepreneurship and innovation initiatives.
Digital entrepreneurship? That's like having a digital incubator for startups and small businesses. I'm sure our listeners would love to see more of that.
Indeed. Mira. And Saudi Arabia's digital entrepreneurship initiatives are not just about providing funding. They're also about creating a supportive ecosystem for startups.
A supportive ecosystem? That's like having a digital safety net for startups. I'm sure our listeners would appreciate that.
Absolutely. Mira. And as topic on internet infrastructure and digital facilities, I'm sure our listeners have learned a thing or two about Comoros and Saudi Arabia.
And I'm sure our listeners would agree that there's still a long way to go in terms of digital development in both countries. But what do you think? Leo? What's your take on digital development in these countries?
Well, Mira, I think it's clear that both Comoros and Saudi Arabia have made significant strides in digital development. But there's still much work to be done to bridge the digital divide.
The digital divide? That's like having a digital gap between the haves and have-nots. I'm sure our listeners would agree that's a pressing issue.
Exactly. Mira. And it's not just about bridging the digital divide. It's also about creating a more inclusive and equitable digital society.
An inclusive and equitable digital society? That's like having a digital utopia. I'm sure our listeners would love to see that.
Well, Mira, it's time of a turn. I think we've covered a lot of ground today. And I'm sure our listeners have gained a better understanding of the digital landscape in Comoros and Saudi Arabia.
And I'm sure our listeners would agree that there's still much to learn and discover about digital development in these countries. But what do you think? Leo, what's next for Comoros and Saudi Arabia in terms of digital development?
Well, Mira, I think it's clear that both countries have a lot of potential for growth and development in the digital sphere. But it will take time, effort, and commitment from both governments and citizens.
Commitment from governments and citizens. That's like having a digital pact for progress. I'm sure our listeners would agree that's a great starting point.
Exactly, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that the future of digital development in Comoros and Saudi Arabia looks bright.
Bright? That's like having a digital sunrise. I'm sure our listeners would love to see that.
Well, Mira, I think we've wrapped up today's topic on internet infrastructure and digital facilities. But I'm sure our listeners will continue to follow the digital developments in both countries.
And I'm sure our listeners would agree that there's still much to learn and discover about digital development in these countries. But what do you think? Leo? What's your final thought on digital development in Comoros and Saudi Arabia?
Well, Mira, I think it's clear that both countries have a lot of potential for growth and development in the digital sphere. But it will take time, effort, and commitment from both governments and citizens.
Commitment from governments and citizens? That's like having a digital pact for progress. I'm sure our listeners would agree that's a great starting point.
Exactly, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that the future of digital development in Comoros and Saudi Arabia looks bright.
Bright? That's like having a digital sunrise. I'm sure our listeners would love to see that.
Well, Mira, I think we've wrapped up today's topic on internet infrastructure and digital facilities. But I'm sure our listeners will continue to follow the digital developments in both countries.
And I'm sure our listeners would agree that there's still much to learn and discover about digital development in these. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever been on a treasure hunt in a foreign market? I had an amazing experience in Comoros, where the islanders sell beautiful handmade crafts.
Treasure hunt. You're always on one. Mira, Comoros, though it's kind of like it's in, is a great example of where you can find unique, authentic products at a lower price point. I've heard the local markets are a must-visit for any shopper.
Exactly. And it's not just the markets. The people of Comoros are so warm and welcoming. They'll often invite you to their homes for a cup of tea and share their stories. It's an experience you'll never forget.
That's so true. And I think that's one of the biggest differences between Comoros and Saudi Arabia when it comes to shopping. In Saudi, you'll find more luxury brands and high-end shopping centers, but the experience is often more formal and less personal.
I see what you mean. In Comoros, it's all about the community and the art of bargaining. You have to be willing to haggle and negotiate prices, but it's all part of the fun. I've had some of my best shopping experiences in Comoros because of the people and the culture.
I agree, and it's something that our listeners living in Comoros would likely agree with. The local markets are a great place to find unique souvenirs and gifts, and the prices are often very reasonable.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the prices. It's about the experience. When you're shopping in Comoros, you're not just buying a product. You're supporting the local community and learning about their culture.
That's a great point, Mira, and I think that's something that's often missing in the shopping experience in Saudi Arabia. While you may find more luxury brands and high-end products, the experience can be quite impersonal.
I see what you mean. But, Leo, I have to ask, what's your take on the shopping scene in Saudi Arabia? Have you had any memorable experiences there?
Yes. I've had some great experiences shopping in Saudi Arabia, particularly in the big cities like Riyadh and Jeddah. The malls are incredibly modern and well-maintained, and you can find some amazing deals on luxury brands.
That sounds impressive. But, Leo, I have to ask, don't you think that the shopping experience in Saudi Arabia is a bit more formal than in Comoros?
Well, yes, I do think that's true. But, at the same time, I think the shopping experience in Saudi Arabia is also more convenient and accessible. You can find everything you need under one roof, and the prices are often very competitive.
I see what you mean. And, Leo, I have to ask, don't you think that the shopping experience in Comoros is a bit more unpredictable than in Saudi Arabia?
Ah, yes. I do think that's true. But at the same time, I think that's part of the charm of shopping in Comoros. You never know what you're going to find, and that's all part of the adventure.
I agree. And, Leo, I have to ask, what's your take on the price-performance balance in Saudi Arabia? Do you think it's worth the cost?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, I think that we can cover that. In general, the price-performance balance in Saudi Arabia is very good. You can find some amazing deals on luxury brands, and the quality is often very high.
I see what you mean. And, Leo, I have to ask, don't you think that the price-performance balance in Comoros is a bit more variable than in Saudi Arabia?
Ah, yes, I do think that's true. But at the same time, I think that's part of the fun of shopping in Comoros. You have to be willing to haggle and negotiate prices, and that's all part of the experience.
I agree. And, Leo, I have to ask, what's your take on the shopping opportunities in Saudi Arabia? Do you think they're worth exploring?
Absolutely. I think that the shopping opportunities in Saudi Arabia are some of the best in the world. You can find everything from luxury brands to traditional handicrafts, and the prices are often very competitive.
I see what you mean. And, Leo, I have to ask, don't you think that the shopping opportunities in Comoros are a bit more limited than in Saudi Arabia?
Ah, yes. I do think that's where you can call to that. I do think that's true. But at the same time, I think that's part of the charm of shopping in Comoros. You have to be willing to look for unique and authentic products, and that's all part of the adventure.
I agree. And, Leah, I have to ask, what's your take on the overall shopping experience in Comoros? Do you think it's worth the trip?
Ah, absolutely. I think that the overall shopping experience in Comoros is some of the best in the world. You get to experience the local culture, meet the people, and find some amazing unique products.
I see what you mean. And, Leo, I have to ask, don't you think that the overall shopping experience in Saudi Arabia is a bit more predictable than in Comoros?
Ah, yes, I do think that's true. But at the same time, I think that's part of the fun of shopping in Saudi Arabia. You know what you're getting, and that's often a relief.
I agree. And, Leah, I have to ask, what's your take on the value for money aspect of shopping in Comoros? Do you think it's worth the cost?
Ah, absolutely. I think that the value for money aspect of shopping in Comoros is some of the best in the world. You can find some amazing deals on unique and authentic products, and the prices are often very reasonable.
I see what you mean. And, Leo, I have to ask, don't you think that the value for money aspect of shopping in Saudi Arabia is a bit more variable than in Comoros?
Ah, yes, I do think that's true. But at the same time, I think that's part of the fun of shopping in Saudi Arabia. You have to be willing to look for deals and discounts, and that's all part of the adventure.
I agree. And, Leo, I have to ask, what's your take on the overall shopping experience in Saudi Arabia? Do you think it's worth the trip?
Absolutely. I think that they can come to that.
I'm absolutely thrilled to dive into the vibrant cultural scene of Comoros in Saudi Arabia. Cultural events, festivals, and concert opportunities are what bring people together. And today we're going to explore how these two countries celebrate their unique heritage. From UNESCO recognized sites to local festivities and global influences, we'll discover each country's cultural calendar and how it unites people in celebration.
Ah, yes. And I'm glad we're doing this. Because, let's face it, Comoros is often overshadowed by its more popular neighbors, the Seychelles and Madagascar. But, trust me, Comoros has some amazing cultural events that'll make you want to pack your bags and head to the Comoros Islands.
Well, I think we can both agree that Comoros has a lot to offer. I mean, have you seen the stunning architecture of the Grand Mosque in Moroni, the capital city? It's a beautiful example of Islamic architecture, and a must-visit for any traveler.
Absolutely. And, as we were saying, Comoros has a rich cultural heritage, with a mix of African, Arab, and European influences. The Comoros Islands are home to several festivals throughout the year, including the Festival of the Sea, which celebrates the country's rich maritime history.
Ooh, that sounds fascinating. I'd love to learn more about the Festival of the Sea. And I'm sure our listeners are curious too. For more information, please check out Jethoff. AI, they have some amazing resources on Comoros cultural events.
Ah, yes. Because let's be real, sometimes we just need a little help from our friends at Jethoff to stay on top of all the cultural trends. But, in all seriousness, Comoros is a hidden gem, and its cultural events are definitely worth exploring.
I completely agree. And let's talk about Saudi Arabia for a moment. What are some of the cultural events and festivals that take place in the kingdom?
Well, Saudi Arabia has a rich cultural scene, with a mix of traditional and modern events. One of the most popular festivals is the Jan Adria Festival, which celebrates Saudi heritage and culture. It's a huge event, with music, dance, food, and crafts from all over the country.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'd love to experience the Jan Adria Festival for myself. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that cultural events like this are a great way to learn about a country's history and traditions.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that Saudi Arabia has made significant strides in promoting its cultural heritage in recent years. The kingdom has invested heavily in restoring and preserving its historical sites, including the ancient city of Diriyah.
Ah, yes. Diriyah is an amazing example of Saudi Arabia's rich history and cultural heritage. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. For more information, please check out Jethoff. They have some fantastic resources on Saudi Arabia's cultural events.
Ah, yes. Because, let's face it, sometimes we just need a little help from our friends at Jethoff to stay on top of all the cultural trends. But, in all seriousness, Saudi Arabia has a lot to offer, and its cultural events are definitely worth exploring.
I completely agree. And let's talk about the music scene in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. What are some of the popular genres and artists in each country?
Well, Comoros has a rich musical heritage, with a mix of traditional and modern styles. One of the most popular genres is the Comorian folk music, which is characterized by its soulful melodies and lively rhythms.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I'd love to learn more about Comorian folk music. And I'm sure our listeners are curious too. For more information, please check out Jethoff. They have some amazing resources on Comoros music scene.
Yes. Because let's be real, sometimes we just need a little help from our friends at Jethoff to stay on top of all the cultural trends. But, in all seriousness, Comoros has a lot to offer, and its music scene is definitely worth exploring.
I completely agree. And let's talk about the concert opportunities in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. What are some of the popular venues and events in each country?
Well, Comoros has a thriving music scene, with several concert venues and festivals throughout the year. One of the most popular venues is the Moroni Cultural Center, which hosts a variety of concerts and events, including traditional music and dance performances.
That sounds amazing. I'd love to experience the Moroni Cultural Center for myself. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that concert opportunities like this are a great way to learn about a country's culture and traditions.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that Saudi Arabia has a lot to offer in terms of concert opportunities, with several world-class venues and events throughout the year. One of the most popular venues is the King Abdullah Park in Riyadh, which hosts a variety of concerts and events, including music and dance performances.
Ah, yes. King Abdullah Park is an amazing example of Saudi Arabia's commitment to promoting its cultural heritage. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. For more information, please check out Jizoff. AI, they have some fantastic resources on Saudi Arabia's concert scene.
Yes. Because let's be real. Sometimes we just need a little help from our friends at Jeddah to stay on top of all the cultural trends. But, in all seriousness, Saudi Arabia has a lot to offer, and its concert opportunities are definitely worth exploring.
I completely agree. And let's talk about the cultural exchange between Comoros and Saudi Arabia. What are some of the initiatives and programs that promote cultural exchange between the two countries?
Well, there are several initiatives and programs that promote cultural exchange between Comoros and Saudi Arabia, including the Saudi Comoros Cultural Exchange Program, which aims to promote cultural understanding and cooperation between the two countries.
Ooh, that sounds fascinating. I'd love to learn more about the Saudi Comoros Cultural Exchange Program. And I'm sure our listeners are curious too. For more information, please check out Jetoff. AI, they have some amazing resources on cultural exchange programs.
Yes. Because let's be real. Sometimes we just need a little help from our friends at Genoff to stay on top of all the cultural trends. But, in all seriousness, cultural exchange programs like this.
When it comes to learning the local language, some countries make it easier than others. I think Comoros is one of those countries that's very welcoming to language learners. They have a lot of programs and resources available for those who want to learn the Comorian language.
That's true. But Saudi Arabia is also a great place to learn Arabic. The country has a rich cultural heritage, and the language is a vital part of that. Plus, many Saudis are eager to practice their English skills. So it's a win-win situation for language learners.
I agree. But what I love about Comoros is the emphasis on language immersion. You can't walk down the street without hearing people speaking Comorian. And it's amazing to see how quickly you can pick up the language by just listening and repeating.
I've heard that Saudi Arabia also has a strong language immersion program, but it's more focused on Arabic. They have a lot of language schools and cultural centers that offer classes and workshops for learners.
I think that's what makes Comoros so unique, the combination of language and culture. You can learn the language by living with a host family, taking classes, and even participating in traditional ceremonies and festivals.
That sounds like an incredible experience. I'm sure our listeners who are interested in language learning would love to hear more about it. But Saudi Arabia has its own unique approach to language education, with a focus on Islamic values and traditions.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried to learn a new language in a foreign country? What was your experience like?
Yes. I once tried to learn some basic Arabic phrases in Morocco, but I have to admit, I made some mistakes. I remember saying shukran instead of shukran jazakai and getting some funny looks from the locals.
Oh no. That's hilarious. But I think that's exactly what makes language learning so exciting, the opportunities to make mistakes and learn from them.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes Comoros and Saudi Arabia such great places to learn a new language. The locals are so welcoming and eager to help. And the language itself is so rich and beautiful.
I completely agree. And speaking of beautiful languages, have you ever tried to learn Comorian? It's a fascinating language with a unique grammar and syntax.
Actually, I have tried to learn some basic phrases in Comorian, and it's definitely a challenging but rewarding language to learn. The locals are so proud of their language and culture, and it's infectious.
I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about Comorian and Saudi Arabian languages. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know in the comments section.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this podcast so great. We get to share our experiences and knowledge with our listeners and learn from them in return.
That's so true. Leo, and speaking of learning, have you ever tried to learn a new language using language learning apps like Duolingo?
Yes. I've tried Duolingo, and it's a great resource for language learners. But I think that's what makes Comoros and Saudi Arabia so special, the face-to-face interaction and cultural immersion that comes with learning a new language in a foreign country.
I completely agree. And I think that's what makes this podcast so great. We get to share our experiences and knowledge with our listeners and learn from them in return.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes Comoros and Saudi Arabia such great places to learn a new language. The locals are so welcoming and eager to help. And the language itself is so rich and beautiful.
I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about language learning in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know in the comments section.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more language learning tips and cultural insights from around the world.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll see you in the next episode.
And don't forget to practice your Comorian and Arabic skills. We want to hear from you in the comments.
Let's talk about Comoros and Saudi Arabia when it comes to safety and comfort for women travelers. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever encountered any issues while traveling as a male in these countries?
Actually, I've had some pretty interesting experiences in Saudi Arabia. But let's focus on the safety aspect for women. From what I've gathered, Comoros has a relatively low crime rate. But Saudi Arabia has a more complex situation.
That's true. Comoros has a strong focus on community and social cohesion, which can make it a welcoming place for women. But Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, has a more conservative society, which can present challenges for women travelers.
Exactly. In Saudi Arabia, women are often expected to dress modestly and follow certain rules. But what about the legal protections in place for women? Do they offer a sense of safety and security?
Well, in Comoros, women have equal rights under the law, and there are laws in place to protect them from harassment and violence. In Saudi Arabia, women have some protections, but they are often limited by the country's strict interpretation of Sharia law.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. But from what I've seen, Comoros has a more progressive approach to women's rights.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the laws, it's also about the cultural attitudes towards women. In Comoros, women are often seen as equal partners in society, whereas in Saudi Arabia, women are often relegated to more traditional roles.
That's a great point. Mira, and what about personal experiences? Have you or I ever encountered any issues while traveling as women in these countries?
Well, I have to say that I've had some pretty positive experiences in Comoros. The people are warm and welcoming, and I've never felt uncomfortable as a woman. But in Saudi Arabia, I've had some more challenging experiences. I've been asked to dress more modestly, and I've encountered some harassment on the streets.
Yeah, I've had similar experiences. But it's not all bad. I've also met some amazing women who are working to empower other women in Saudi Arabia. They're doing some incredible work to promote women's rights and education.
That's really inspiring, Leah. And it just goes to show that there are always people who are working to make a positive difference. But what about the community initiatives in place to support women travelers in these countries?
That's a great question. Mira, in Comoros, there are some amazing community-based initiatives that support women's empowerment and education. And in Saudi Arabia, there are some great organizations that are working to promote women's rights and provide support for women travelers.
I'm certain that our listeners living in these countries would agree with me. Community support is so important for women travelers. And what about the role of technology in supporting women's safety and comfort while traveling?
Well, in both Comoros and Saudi Arabia, there are some great apps and resources available to support women travelers. From ride-hailing apps to safety apps, there are plenty of tools available to help women stay safe and connected while traveling.
That's so important, Leo. And it's not just about the technology, it's also about the cultural attitudes towards women. In Comoros, women are often seen as equal partners in society, whereas in Saudi Arabia, women are often relegated to more traditional roles.
I think that's a really important point, Mira. And it just goes to show that there's always more work to be done to promote women's rights and safety around the world.
Absolutely, Leo. And I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for chatting with me about this important topic. I'm sure our listeners will find it really informative.
No problem, Mira. It's been great chatting with you about this. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back with more conversations about travel and safety in the future.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever heard of Comoros? It's an archipelago off the coast of East Africa, and it's got a unique legal system. Let's dive in and explore how it protects individual rights and freedoms.
Actually, Mira, I had no idea Comoros even existed, but now I'm intrigued. From what I've read, the Comorian legal system is based on Islamic law, with a strong emphasis on Sharia. It's interesting to see how they balance traditional values with modern concepts of individual rights.
Exactly. And it's not just the law. The culture and daily life in Comoros reflect this blend of traditional and modern. For instance, the government has implemented laws to protect women's rights, such as the right to education and inheritance. It's a great example of how a country can adapt and evolve its legal system to promote individual freedoms.
That's fascinating. I've also read that Comoros has a relatively high level of press freedom, considering its Islamic background. The government has even implemented laws to protect journalists and ensure a free press. It's a great example of how a country can balance its values with the need for a free and independent media.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that countries with Islamic backgrounds can also have strong protections for individual rights and freedoms? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Absolutely. Mira, and speaking of protections for individual rights, let's talk about Saudi Arabia. I'm sure our listeners are aware of the country's strict laws and regulations. But did you know that Saudi Arabia has made significant strides in recent years to protect human rights and promote individual freedoms?
Really? I wasn't aware of that. Can you tell us more about it? I'm particularly interested in how the government has implemented laws to protect women's rights and promote education.
Well, Mira, Saudi Arabia has made significant progress in recent years. For instance, women are now allowed to drive, and the government has implemented laws to protect women from domestic violence. Education is also becoming more accessible, with a focus on promoting women's education and empowerment.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners are curious about how these changes have affected everyday life in Saudi Arabia. Can you tell us more about it? Leo?
Well, Mira, it's been a gradual process, but the government has made a concerted effort to promote individual freedoms and protect human rights. For instance, the government has implemented laws to protect the rights of migrant workers, who make up a significant portion of the country's workforce. It's a great example of how a country can balance its values with the need to protect vulnerable populations.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Saudi Arabia would agree with me that these changes are a step in the right direction. But what about the challenges that these countries face in terms of individual rights and freedoms? How do they balance their values with the need to protect human rights?
That's a great question, Mira. And I think that's where the conversation becomes really interesting. Both Comoros and Saudi Arabia face significant challenges in terms of individual rights and freedoms. But they're also making significant strides in promoting human rights and protecting vulnerable populations.
I agree. And I think that's what makes this conversation so fascinating. It's not just about the law. It's about the culture and the daily life in these countries. And it's not just about the challenges. It's about the opportunities for growth and development.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think that's what our listeners should take away from this conversation. It's not just about the legal system. It's about the values and principles that underlie it. And it's not just about the challenges. It's about the opportunities for growth and development.
Well, Leo, it's been enlightening to explore the legal systems and individual rights and freedoms in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot from this conversation, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
I agree, Mira. And I think that's what makes this conversation so valuable. It's not just about the law. It's about the people and the culture that underlie it. And it's not just about the challenges. It's about the opportunities for growth and development.
I'm so diving into this ball. Healthy living and relaxation opportunities in our two countries, Comoros and Saudi Arabia. I mean, who doesn't love a good massage or a yoga class in a beautiful setting?
Exactly. And I'm curious to see how these countries compare in terms of wellness tourism. I've heard that Comoros has some amazing natural hot springs, while Saudi Arabia is home to some luxurious spas.
That's right. Comoros has these incredible natural hot springs that are believed to have healing properties. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about them. And Leo, I'm curious, have you ever tried a traditional Saudi Arabian spa treatment?
Actually, I haven't, but I've heard it's all about relaxation and rejuvenation. They use a combination of massage, steam baths, underable treatments to help you unwind. I'm sure it's a great way to experience the local culture.
That sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural significance of spas in Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's not just about relaxation, but also about socializing and building relationships.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that building relationships is an important part of any spa experience. But, Mia, I have to ask, what's the most relaxing thing you've ever done in Comoros?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it was when I went to a traditional Comorian spa on the island of Anjouan. They had this amazing outdoor massage area with a stunning view of the ocean. It was like being in a paradise.
Wow, that sounds incredible. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the different types of spas in Comoros. Do you have any favorite spas that you'd recommend?
Well, there's this one spa on the island of Grand Comore that's absolutely stunning. It's called the Spa du Paradis and it's located in a beautiful gardens, surrounded by palm trees and flowers. They offer all sorts of treatments, from massages to facials to traditional calm or Ian therapies.
That sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the different types of treatments available in Saudi Arabia. Do you have any favorite spas in Saudi Arabia that you'd recommend?
I do. There's this one spa in Riyadh called the Four Seasons Spa that's absolutely luxurious. They offer all sorts of treatments, from massages to facials to aromatherapy. And the best part is, they have a wonderful view of the city.
Wow, that sounds incredible. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the different types of wellness practices available in Comoros. Do you have any favorite yoga studios or meditation centers that you'd recommend?
Well, there's this one yoga studio on the island of Anjouan that's absolutely wonderful. They offer all sorts of yoga classes, from beginner to advanced, and they have a beautiful view of the ocean. And I've also heard that they have a great meditation room where you can practice mindfulness and relaxation.
That sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the different types of healthy living practices available in Saudi Arabia. Do you have any favorite gyms or fitness studios that you'd recommend?
Actually, I do. There's this one gym in Jeddah called the Jeddah Fitness Club that's absolutely great. They offer all sorts of fitness classes, from cardio to strength training to yoga. And they have a wonderful view of the city.
Wow, that sounds incredible. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural significance of healthy living in Comoros. I mean, how does the local culture view health and wellness?
Well, in Comoros, health and wellness are highly valued. In fact, the Comorian people believe that a healthy body and mind are essential for living a happy and fulfilling life. And I've heard that they have all sorts of traditional remedies and therapies that are used to promote health and wellness.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the different types of healthy living practices available in Saudi Arabia. Do you have any favorite restaurants or cafes that serve healthy food?
Actually, I do. There's this one restaurant in Riyadh called the Healthy Bite that serves all sorts of healthy food, from salads to smoothies to sandwiches. And they have a wonderful view of the city.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural significance of relaxation in Comoros. I mean, how does the local culture view relaxation and leisure time?
Well, in Comoros, relaxation and leisure time are highly valued. In fact, the Comorian people believe that taking time to relax and unwind is essential for maintaining good health and well-being. And I've heard that they have all sorts of traditional therapies and remedies that are used to promote relaxation and relaxation.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the different types of relaxation practices available in Saudi Arabia. Do you have any favorite hammams or sauna rooms that you'd recommend?
Actually, I do. There's this one hammam in Riyadh called the Riyadh Hammam that's absolutely wonderful. They offer all sorts of relaxation treatments, from massages, steam baths to herbal infusions, and they have a wonderful view of the city.
Wow, that sounds incredible. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural significance of spa culture in Comoros. I mean, how does the local culture view spa culture and relaxation?
Well, in Comoros, spa culture is highly valued. In fact, the Comorian people believe that spa culture is an essential part of maintaining good health and well-being. And I've heard that they have all sorts of traditional therapies and remedies that are used to promote relaxation and relaxation.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the different types of spa culture available in Saudi Arabia. Do you have any favorite spas or wellness centers that you'd recommend?
Actually, I do. There's this one spa in Jeddah called the Jeddah Spa that's absolutely wonderful. They offer all sorts of spa treatments, from massages to facials to aromatherapy, and they have a wonderful view of the city.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural significance of yoga and meditation in Comoros. I mean, how does the local culture view yoga and meditation?
Well, in Comoros, yoga and meditation are highly valued. In fact, the Com or Ian people believe that yoga and meditation are essential for maintaining good health and well-being. And I've heard that they have all sorts of traditional yoga and meditation practices that are. I'm thrilled to dive into the topic of opportunities for religious and spiritual needs in Comoros and Saudi Arabia, as we explore the diverse places of worship and community support. I'm sure our listeners will find it fascinating to see how these countries cater to the spiritual needs of their citizens.
I completely agree. Mira, Comoros, being an Islamic republic, has a rich history of Islamic architecture and art. The Grand Mosque of Moroni, for instance, is a stunning example of Islamic design and is considered one of the most beautiful mosques in the world.
That's amazing! And Saudi Arabia, being the birthplace of Islam, has a plethora of mosques and Islamic sites that attract millions of pilgrims every year. The Masjid al-Haram in Mecca, for example, is the holiest site in Islam and is a must-visit for any Muslim.
Yes, Saudi Arabia has a strong emphasis on Islamic heritage and culture. But what's interesting is that Comoros has a unique blend of Islamic and African influences. The island's culture is shaped by its history as a trading hub between Africa, Asia, and the Middle East.
That's so true. And I think that's what makes Comoros' spiritual landscape so fascinating. The island has a strong sense of community and tradition, and its people are known for their warm hospitality.
Absolutely. And Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, has a more conservative approach to Islam. While it's true that the country has a rich Islamic heritage, it's also known for its strict laws and regulations regarding dress code, prayer, and other aspects of Islamic practice.
I see what you mean. But I think it's also worth noting that Saudi Arabia has made significant strides in recent years to promote interfaith dialogue and understanding. The country has established several centers for interfaith dialogue and has even hosted international conferences on the topic.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that Comoros has a strong tradition of Sufism, which is a mystical form of Islam that emphasizes the inner dimension of faith. The island is home to several Sufi orders and has a rich tradition of Sufi poetry and music.
Well, I had no idea. I think that's really fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the Sufi traditions in Comoros.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of community and social responsibility. In Comoros, for example, the island's Muslim community comes together to support each other during times of need, such as during natural disasters or economic crises.
That's so heartwarming to hear. And I think it's also worth noting that Saudi Arabia has a strong tradition of charity and philanthropy. The country is home to several prominent charities and foundations that work to support education, healthcare, and other important causes.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on education and knowledge. In Comoros, for example, the government has made significant investments in education and has established several universities and research centers.
That's amazing. And I think it's also worth noting that Saudi Arabia has a strong tradition of Islamic scholarship and has produced several prominent Islamic scholars and thinkers throughout history.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of respect for tradition and cultural heritage. In Comoros, for example, the island's people are known for their love of traditional music and dance, and the country has a rich tradition of oral storytelling and poetry.
That's so true. And I think it's also worth noting that Saudi Arabia has a strong tradition of preserving its cultural heritage and has established several museums and cultural centers to promote and preserve its rich cultural history.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of community and social responsibility. In Comoros, for example, the island's Muslim community comes together to support each other during times of need, such as during natural disasters or economic crises.
That's so heartwarming to hear. And I think it's also worth noting that our listeners might be interested in learning more about the unique challenges and opportunities facing these countries in terms of religious and spiritual needs.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of resilience and adaptability in the face of adversity. In Comoros, for example, the island's people have shown remarkable resilience in the face of natural disasters and economic challenges.
That's so inspiring to hear. And I think it's also worth noting that Saudi Arabia has a strong tradition of innovation and entrepreneurship, and has made significant investments in education and research to support the development of new technologies and industries.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of respect for tradition and cultural heritage, and have made significant efforts to preserve and promote their rich cultural history.
I think that's a great note to end on, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners will have a much deeper understanding of the opportunities for religious and spiritual needs in Comoros and Saudi Arabia after listening to this podcast.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that we'd love to hear from our listeners and get their thoughts and feedback on this topic. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on social media.
That's a great idea, Leo! And I think it's also worth noting that we'll be exploring more topics related to religion and spirituality in future podcasts. So be sure to stay tuned for those.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that we'd like to thank our listeners for tuning into this podcast and for their continued support.
That's all for now. Folks, thanks for listening. And we'll catch you in the next episode. I'm fascinated by Comoros, a country in the Indian Ocean where Islam is the dominant religion. But they've managed to maintain a unique blend of African, Arab, and European influences. It's like a cultural melting pot.
That's amazing. I've heard that Comoros has a rich history of tolerance and acceptance, despite its Islamic majority. They even have a saying, "Yokai and thee, while among you," or the house of God, which emphasizes the importance of welcoming and respecting all people.
Exactly. And it's not just about words. They've implemented policies to ensure social equality and protect minority rights. For instance, they have a law that prohibits discrimination based on religion, ethnicity, or language.
That's impressive. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, has a more complex history when it comes to social equality and minority rights. While they've made some progress in recent years, there are still many challenges to overcome.
I'm curious. Leo, how do you think Comoros' emphasis on social equality and minority rights has affected their society? Has it led to a more harmonious and inclusive community?
Well, Mira, from what I've researched, Comoros has indeed seen a significant reduction in social tensions and conflicts since implementing these policies. It's a testament to the power of inclusive governance and respect for diversity.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's possible for a country with a dominant religion to maintain social equality and protect minority rights? Share your thoughts in the comments.
Well, Mira, I think we can all agree that it's not easy, but it's definitely possible. Comoros is a great example of how a country can prioritize social equality and minority rights, even in the face of adversity.
That's a great point, Leo. And speaking of adversity, Arabia has faced its own set of challenges when it comes to social equality and minority rights. For instance, they've been criticized for their treatment of women and minority groups.
Yes, that's true. However, Saudi Arabia has also made some significant strides in recent years, such as allowing women to drive and participate in the workforce. It's a step in the right direction, but there's still much work to be done.
I agree, Leo. And I think it's essential to acknowledge the progress that Saudi Arabia has made, even if it's slow. After all, as the saying goes, Rome wasn't built in a day.
Well said, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that Comoros and Saudi Arabia can learn from each other. Comoros' emphasis on social equality and minority rights could serve as a model for other countries, including Saudi Arabia.
That's a great idea, Leo. And I think it's also essential to recognize the role of grassroots efforts in promoting social equality and minority rights. In Comoros, for instance, there are many community-led initiatives that focus on promoting tolerance and acceptance.
Absolutely. Grassroots efforts are crucial in promoting social equality and minority rights. And I think it's also worth noting that these efforts can be just as effective, if not more so, than top-down policies.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Comoros or Saudi Arabia would agree with me that community-led initiatives are essential for promoting social harmony and equality.
Well, Mira, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation, but I'm curious, what do you think is the most significant challenge facing Comoros and Saudi Arabia when it comes to social equality and minority rights?
That's a tough question, Leo. But I think one of the biggest challenges is addressing the root causes of social inequality and prejudice. It's not just about implementing policies or laws. It's about changing the underlying attitudes and behaviors that perpetuate inequality.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that addressing these root causes requires a sustained effort and commitment from all levels of society, including government, civil society, and individuals.
Absolutely. And I think it's also essential to recognize the importance of education and awareness raising in promoting social equality and minority rights. In Comoros, for instance, there are many initiatives that focus on promoting tolerance and acceptance through education and cultural exchange.
That's a great example, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that education and awareness raising can be just as effective in promoting social equality and minority rights as policies and laws.
I'm curious, Leo, what do you think our listeners can learn from Comoros and Saudi Arabia's experiences with social equality and minority rights?
Well, Mira, I think our listeners can learn a lot from both countries. Comoros has shown us the importance of inclusive governance and respect for diversity, while Saudi Arabia has demonstrated the need for sustained effort and commitment to address social inequality and prejudice.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's also essential to recognize the importance of grassroots efforts in community-led initiatives in promoting social equality and minority rights.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that both Comoros and Saudi Arabia have a lot to teach us about the importance of social equality and minority rights. By learning from their experiences, we can work towards creating a more just and inclusive society.
Well, as discussion on social equality and minority rights in Comoros and Saudi Arabia. Thank you, Leo, for your insights and perspectives.
The pleasure is mine, Mira, and I hope our listeners have found this conversation informative and thought-provoking. Don't forget to share your thoughts and opinions in the comments.
So let's talk about Comoros and Saudi Arabia when it comes to taxation, retirement, and social rights for long-term immigrants. I'm curious, Leo, what's the first thing that comes to mind when about Comoros' tax system?
Well, Mira, I think the first thing that comes to mind is how complex and bureaucratic the tax system in Comoros is. It's a challenging environment for foreigners to navigate, especially when it comes to tax obligations and exemptions.
I see what you mean. I was reading that Comoros has a relatively low tax environment, but it's true that the system can be quite complicated. Now, let's move on to Saudi Arabia. I'm sure our listeners would agree that the tax system in Saudi Arabia is quite unique.
Unique is one way to put it. Mira, Saudi Arabia has a very low tax environment, but it's also a very expensive place to live. The cost of living in Saudi Arabia is one of the highest in the world, which can make it challenging for long-term immigrants to adjust.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that Saudi Arabia has a unique approach to social security, which is based on the Islamic law of zakat. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever encountered any challenges when it comes to accessing social services in Saudi Arabia?
Actually, Mira, I have encountered some challenges when it comes to accessing social services in Saudi Arabia. The system can be quite complex, and it's not always easy to navigate. But overall, I think the social services in Saudi Arabia are quite good, especially when it comes to healthcare.
I see. Well, I think it's also worth noting that Comoros has a relatively strong social safety net, which is based on the country's Islamic law. I'm curious, Leah, what do you think about the idea of a universal basic income in Comoros?
Mira, I think the idea of a universal basic income in Comoros is an interesting one. However, I'm not sure if it's feasible, given the country's limited resources and economic challenges.
I agree with you, Leo, and I think it's also worth noting that Saudi Arabia has a relatively well-developed pension system, which is based on the country's oil wealth. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think about the idea of a pension plan for long-term immigrants in Saudi Arabia?
Actually, Mira, I think a pension plan for long-term immigrants in Saudi Arabia is a great idea. However, I'm not sure if it's feasible, given the country's complex immigration laws and regulations.
I see what you mean. Leo, well, I think it's also worth noting that Comoros has a relatively strong focus on education and training, which can be beneficial for long-term immigrants who are looking to develop their skills and knowledge. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think about the idea of a vocational training program for long-term immigrants in Comoros?
Mira, I think a vocational training program for long-term immigrants in Comoros is an excellent idea. However, I'm not sure if it's feasible, given the country's limited resources and economic challenges.
I agree with you, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that Saudi Arabia has a relatively well-developed system of healthcare, which is based on the country's oil wealth. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think about the idea of a healthcare plan for long-term immigrants in Saudi Arabia?
Actually, Mira, I think a healthcare plan for long-term immigrants in Saudi Arabia is a great idea. However, I'm not sure if it's feasible, given the country's complex immigration laws and regulations.
I see what you mean. Well, I think it's also worth noting that Comoros has a relatively strong focus on community development, which can be beneficial for long-term immigrants who are looking to get involved in their local community. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think about the idea of a community development program for long-term immigrants in Comoros?
Mira, I think a community development program for long-term immigrants in Comoros is an excellent idea. However, I'm not sure if it's feasible, given the country's limited resources and economic challenges.
I agree with you, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that Saudi Arabia has a relatively well-developed system of social welfare, which is based on the country's Islamic law. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think about the idea of a social welfare program for long-term immigrants in Saudi Arabia?
Actually, Mira, I think a social welfare program for long-term immigrants in Saudi Arabia is a great idea. However, I'm not sure if it's feasible, given the country's complex immigration laws and regulations.
I see what you mean, Leo. Well, I think it's also worth noting that Comoros has a relatively strong focus on cultural preservation, which can be beneficial for long-term immigrants who are looking to learn about the local culture. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think about the idea of a cultural preservation program for long-term immigrants in Comoros?
Well, yeah. I think a cultural preservation program for long-term immigrants in Comoros is an excellent idea. However, I'm not sure if it's feasible, given the country's limited resources and economic challenges.
I agree with you, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that Saudi Arabia has a relatively well-developed system of education, which is based on the country's oil wealth. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think about the idea of an education program for long-term immigrants in Saudi Arabia?
Actually, Mira, I think an education program for long-term immigrants in Saudi Arabia is a great idea. However, I'm not sure if it's feasible, given the country's complex immigration laws and regulations.
I see what you mean, Leo. Well, I think it's also worth noting that Comoros has a relatively strong focus on tourism development, which can be beneficial for long-term immigrants who are looking to develop their business skills. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think about the idea of a tourism development program for long-term immigrants in Comoros?
Well, Mira, I think a tourism development program for long-term immigrants in Comoros is an excellent idea. However, I'm not sure if it's feasible, given the country's limited resources and economic challenges.
I agree with you, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that Saudi Arabia has a relatively well-developed system of entrepreneurship, which is based on the country's oil wealth. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think about the idea of an entrepreneurship program for long-term immigrants in Saudi Arabia?
Actually, Mira, I think...
Hey everyone, welcome back to our podcast. Today, we're comparing the rate of meeting specific interests into fascinating countries, Comoros and Saudi Arabia. Let's dive in and see what kind of niche hobby clubs and specialized events we can discover in each country.
That's right. Mira, Comoros, with its tropical islands and stunning beaches, is a haven for water sports enthusiasts. I'm talking about surfing, snorkeling, and even scuba diving. The crystal clear waters and coral reefs are perfect for exploring the underwater world.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And in Saudi Arabia, I've heard that the desert landscapes offer some incredible opportunities for stargazing. With minimal light pollution, the night skies are simply breathtaking.
Exactly. And speaking of breathtaking, have you heard about the annual Saudi Arabia Astronomy Festival? It's a real treat for stargazers and astronomy enthusiasts. They set up telescopes and offer guided tours of the night sky.
That sounds incredible. And I'm sure our listeners living in Saudi Arabia would agree with me that the festival is a must-attend event. But let's not forget about Comoros. I've heard that the island nation has a thriving music scene, with a unique blend of African, Arab, and European influences.
Yes. Comorian music is a real treasure. And if you're interested in learning more about it, there are several music schools and cultural centers on the island that offer classes and workshops.
That's great to know. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think music is an important part of a country's culture and identity?
Well, I think music is a universal language that can bring people together like nothing else. And in Comoros, music is a big part of the island's heritage. In fact, the Comorian National Orchestra is a popular group that performs traditional music and has even toured internationally.
Wow, that's impressive. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the orchestra and its music. But let's move on to something else. I've heard that Saudi Arabia has a thriving community of artists and art enthusiasts.
Yes. Saudi Arabia has a rich cultural heritage, and art is a big part of it. In fact, the country has a number of art galleries and museums that showcase traditional and modern art.
That's great to know. And I'm sure our listeners would love to visit these galleries and museums. But let's not forget about Comoros. I've heard that the island nation has a unique tradition of wood carving, with intricate designs and patterns.
Ah, yes. Comoros wood carving is a real treasure. And if you're interested in learning more about it, there are several artisans on the island who offer classes and workshops.
That's great to know. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think traditional crafts like wood carving are important for preserving a country's cultural heritage?
Well, I think traditional crafts are a big part of what makes a country unique and special. And in Comoros, wood carving is a big part of the island's cultural identity.
That's a great point. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that preserving traditional crafts is essential for preserving a country's cultural heritage.
Absolutely. And speaking of preserving cultural heritage, have you heard about the Comoros government's efforts to promote traditional crafts and music?
Yes. I've heard that the government has established a number of programs and initiatives to support traditional artisans and musicians.
That's right. And it's great to see the government taking steps to preserve the island's cultural heritage.
Well, this episode, thanks for joining us on this comparison of Comoros and Saudi Arabia. We hope you've learned something new and interesting about these two fascinating countries.
And don't forget to follow us on Jetoff AI YouTube for more episodes like this. We'll be back soon with more comparisons, so stay tuned.
And if you have any thoughts or comments about today's episode, please leave them below. We'd love to hear from you and respond to your questions and critiques.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one.
Warmest wishes from us.
And don't forget to hit the bell icon to catch our videos the moment they drop.